book in today's Thom Hartmann Book Club is by Harvey J. Kaye, Professor Harvey Kaye. Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again. This is from the introduction. On December 1st, 1862, in the midst of the Civil War, just weeks before he was to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, President Abraham Lincoln delivered his annual message to Congress. Lincoln firmly believed that the United States had an historic responsibility to demonstrate to the world that people can govern themselves, make equal rights not just a self-evident truth, but a manifest one, and create a political and economic order in which working people, both white and black, are not compelled to bow to anyone, neither aristocrats nor capitalists. Empowered by tens of thousands of black slaves who were already liberating themselves from bondage by escaping to the Union lines, and increasingly confident that the majority of his fellow Americans would recognize the truth of what he was saying, Lincoln closed his address by calling on them to see that the time had come to remember who they were and what they demanded, or what that demanded. He told them that to save the nation and all that it represented, they must live up to the nation's declared revolutionary purpose and promise, and act to radically enhance American freedom by bringing an end to slavery. This is a quote from Lincoln's address. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We say we are for the Union. The world will not forget that we say this. We know how to save the Union. The world knows we do know how to save it. We, even we here, hold the power and bear the responsibility. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom to the free, honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth. We too, end of quote from Lincoln, back to Harvey. We too cannot escape history. Our own struggle to save the nation and the promise it proclaims has begun. Finally, after more than 40 years of fear-driven class war and culture war campaigns against the democratic achievements of generations, the hard-won rights of workers, women and people of color, and the very memory of how they were secured, and now both in the wake of the election debacle of 2016, which gave the presidency to the corrupt, mendacious, racist, sexist, and treacherous demagogue Donald Trump, and continued control of Congress to the formerly conservative but increasingly reactionary Republican Party, and in the face of intensified class and culture war campaigns, we the people have come not only to recognize that American democratic life is in jeopardy, but also to mobilize in hopes of saving it. Millions of us have rallied to the resistance and expressed our democratic fears and desires in action. In the historic Women's March and March for Our Lives of young people, the protests, demonstrations, and legal actions to defend the lives and rights of immigrants and refugees, the Me Too movement to combat sexual assault and harassment, the massive teachers' strikes for higher pay and better funding of public schools in states red and blue, and the enthusiastic canvassing and campaigning for a blue wave to win back Congress in the 2018 midterm elections. But resistance is not enough. The time has come for us to remember who we are and what that demands. The time has come for us to embrace our radical history, the history of how a generation of Americans, high and low, and in all their diversity, not only turned their colonial rebellion into a war for independence, but also imbued American life, whether they all intended it or not, with radical imperative and impulse by declaring a revolutionary promise of freedom, equality, and democracy for all. The history of how generations of radicals and reformers served as the prophetic memory of that promise, and how generations of ordinary men and women, native-born and immigrant, struggled to make real the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to expand not only the we in We the People, but also the powers of the people. And most especially in view of the crises we ourselves face, the history of how our greatest generations confronted and prevailed over the forces that threatened to destroy the nation and bury its revolutionary promise in the 1770s, 1860s, and 1930s and 1940s, not to mention the 1960s, by acting to make the United States both inspired by Washington, Lincoln, and FDR, and pushing them to go farther than they might otherwise have gone. Radically freer, more equal, and more democratic than ever before. The time has come to take hold of that history and make America radical again. I've titled this collection of my speeches and essays, Take Hold of Our History, Make America Radical Again, for reasons that will become obvious, and yet I cannot help but confess that if I had had to title it otherwise, I would have been sorely tempted to use, with full attribution, the title Max Lerner gave to his 1938 work, It Is Later Than You Think, The Need for a Militant Democracy.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Well, it may not seem so, the crisis well, trick or treat. Well, we got a treat. Impeach. Yep, that's what's going on. Welcome. Oh, amazing. The House of Representatives just voted 232 to 196 to begin an impeachment inquiry into Donald Trump in a relatively public way, using a new set of rules, which is actually more favorable to Trump than the House rules that were voted on and used against Bill Clinton or against Richard Nixon. So, you know, and the Republicans are all sitting around going, oh, the process is so unfair. The process is more fair to them now than the process was against Clinton or the process was against Nixon. So let's just set that aside. But there's a much larger issue here. When the judiciary, you know, when the House of Representatives voted to launch an impeachment investigation into Richard Nixon. Now, this was before they even had the tapes. When they voted to launch that inquiry, the vote was 410 yes, 4 no. And those 4 who voted no were all Republicans. So Nixon had 4 Republicans, and this is just to open the inquiry, right? This wasn't to impeach. In fact, they never got to a vote to impeach because Nixon resigned before they could. But just to open the inquiry, 410 to 4. And today we had 2 Democrats who defected, you know, from this, from the Democratic Party, Jeff Van Drewen and Colin Peterson. And they're both Democrats who are in districts where Trump overwhelmingly won, and they're you know, kind of dancing as fast as they can. And I get that, you know, and I'm not going to criticize them for that. They were not decisive votes. But what's the difference between the Nixon vote and this vote today? Why is it that in 1974, Republicans were willing to say, you know, it looks like the president actually committed a crime here. We need to check this out, which is all the inquiry is, right? We need to investigate this. All but 4 Republicans said, yeah, that's a reasonable thing. It does look like the president committed a crime. Well, here we've got a president who has admitted he committed a crime, who has published the crime, or one piece of it, in progress. And yet, no Republicans defected. No Republicans said, well, yeah, it looks like the president committed a crime. Maybe we should check it out. None of them. The only one who voted along with the Democrats was Justin Amash, who has left the Republican Party. He's an independent from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Was a Republican. He came out after he read the Mueller report. He's probably the only Republican who actually read the Mueller report. He read that and he said, you know, there's 10 different instances of obstruction of justice in here. Not to mention all the attempts by the Trump campaign to collude with Russians. They were just incompetent, apparently. So what's the difference between the two? The difference between the two is that 2 years after the Nixon impeachment inquiry, the United States Supreme Court, and this is why I wrote this book about the history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America. 2 years after the Nixon inquiry, the United States Supreme Court ruled that it was perfectly legal for billionaires to own individual politicians. And then 2 years after that, that 76 decision was the Buckley decision. 2 years later, the First National Bank decision. 2 years after that, the Supreme Court ruled that, oh, and by the way, we're going to extend that logic to corporations. They can own politicians too. That was in 76 and 78, and I mean, This is, I mean, just incredible. In fact, when the Judiciary Committee, which was half Republicans, half Democrats, back in the Nixon era in '74, voted to subpoena the tapes, Nixon's tapes, which would be similar to the Judiciary Committee today, voting to subpoena, for example, the transcripts of Nixon's conversation with Erdogan that caused him to stab the Kurds in the back. And I sure hope they go there. That vote was 33-3. Only 3 Republicans supported Nixon in '74. I guarantee you, if that vote was held in the Judiciary Committee today, every single Republican would vote no. Because Trump has delivered for the billionaires. They don't care that he's a bloated orange mobster, that he's all about trying to make more money for himself, that he's, all that stuff is irrelevant, that he's a racist, that he's a misogynist, that he's a hustler. And I don't just mean racist as in, notices racial differences, which I think is a fairly universal experience. I'm talking racist in, this guy uses race for political purposes in a way that is harmful to people. When you look at it, how could Republicans justify this? They can justify it because there's money for it. Politico's reporting that Donald Trump is raising millions of dollars for individual Republican senators. Individual Republican senators. So that they will not, now keep in mind, the trial will be in the Senate. The Republican senators are essentially jurors in this. And there are 3 senators in particular. Trump has sent out a fundraiser. Oh, here it is, right here. Raising money for Colorado's Cory Gardner, Republican from Colorado. He's up for re-election. Iowa's Joni Ernst, a Republican from Iowa. She's up for re-election. North Carolina's Thom Tillis, who has the good sense to spell his first name right, but other than that, Republican from North Carolina. And in his fundraising request to his millions, I get this email, right? Hey, Fred. The email said, if we don't post strong fundraising numbers, we won't be able to defend the president from this baseless impeachment hunt. And then it says, help us, help out Cory Gardner, Joni Ernst, and Thom Tillis. He's explicitly bribing the jurors. He is bribing the jurors. And Richard Painter, who was George W. Bush's ethics advisor, his White House ethics lawyer, Richard Painter calls this felony bribery. When I was 17, there was this girl hanging around the student union at MSU. I was living out in East Lansing at the time, whose father was the Assistant Attorney General for the state of Michigan and was in the middle of the process of prosecuting the mob. He was, specifically, I don't want to get into specifics. Anyhow, he was prosecuting a mob family, and what he was prosecuting them for was bribing a juror. Right, this mobster had basically won a case in court, and it turned out that the reason he won was because he had bribed a juror, maybe more than one juror. I don't recall. And the mob had threatened him, so there was there were police around the house all the time, police protection. And so this girl had to sneak out of the house to come over to the Union Building and hang out and play cards with us and all this kind of. Well, that girl is Louise, my wife. We started dating back then, and we've been married 47 years now, next week. And, that's what we used to do when people bribed jurors. Nixon wasn't raising money for Republicans. He couldn't do that. It was against the law back then. But the Supreme Court blew up these laws. And so now you've got a bunch of Republicans who are basically wholly owned by a group of billionaires and a bunch of large corporations, and they know these Republicans who voted today in the House of Representatives, not one of them broke. Why? It has nothing to do with the case before them. It has to do with the fact that the billionaires are getting what they want. They got $1.5 trillion last year. $1.5 trillion. Just poured down on them like rain. Billionaires today, this was a big news story 2 weeks ago. Billionaires today are paying lower tax rates than working people. They're paying lower tax rates than working people in poverty. They're paying lower tax rates than people making $20,000 a year. Billionaires, which gives them enough money to buy the Republicans, which they've done. And that's what we're seeing here. What we're seeing is the consequence of money in politics. Donald Trump, a mobster in New York, dealing with mobbed up people as a real estate developer, dealing with the Russian and Ukrainian and other, former Soviet mobsters and oligarchs. A mobster then and a mobster now. I mean, this is just absolutely mind-boggling. And check this out. I mean, this is from Politico. It's too much. Democrats shudder at Trump's money machine. Donald Trump and the Republican National Committee have raised more than $300 million this year for his reelection, more than any other sitting president in history. Trump has twice as much cash on hand, $158 million, as Barack Obama and the DNC had at this time in their successful reelection bid in 2012. The campaign spent $4.2 million over the last 90 days advertising on Facebook, and out of that, they got 313,000 new donors. They're investing in Facebook. They're making more money than it costs them. He's sitting on $300 million, $158 million on hand. And how much does the DNC have on hand right now? $8 million, $8.2 million. The money is pouring in. This is the one thing that really troubles and concerns me about the upcoming elections, both the primary and the general election, is that the billionaires and the corporations have been unleashed. And, they're coming for us. They're taking down our democratic process. They have bought an entire political party. 18 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And then you look back at Ken Vogel's reporting in Politico about how, Heritage and other right-wing groups are funding to the tune of millions of dollars right-wing talk show hosts. They're taking them too. And welcome back. Julia, listening on KBCS in Auburn, Washington. Hey, Julia, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call.
Sure.
I have a question in history because I'm thinking about Medicare for All. If it passes, it's going to be huge restructuring for the insurance industry. And in order to keep our planet alive, we're going to have renewable fuels, and that's going to be huge restructuring for the oil and fossil fuels industry. And has there ever been a time in history when our economy had to be fundamentally restructured?
Yes, the biggest one was the era between 1929 and 1938.
Yeah, FDR.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, not just FDR. It collapsed with Hoover. Hoover tried to do a few things. He had a Reconstruction administration. He tried to roll out some small version of basically the New Deal. It didn't really work.
Yeah.
But that was a complete reorganization. And actually, arguably, there was another one in 1920, because in 1920, when Warren Harding successfully ran for president, the top tax rate was up to 91%. Corporations were paying a fair amount of taxes, and there was substantial regulation in place left over from the end of the chartermongering era, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, the Tillman Act of 1907. Sherman Act, of course, prevented corporations from acting as cartels, as trusts, including in political ways. And the Tillman Act of 1907 made it a federal crime, 2 years in prison, for even a lawyer or an officer of a corporation that gave any money to any candidate for federal office. And so,
I know.
And then
we
Harding
don't have
came
that in place anymore.
Right, that's correct. That was struck down by the Supreme Court in 76, 78, and 2010. But then Warren Harding came in 1920 on a campaign of lowering taxes and deregulating industry. His campaign slogan was less government in business, more business in government, or words to that effect, essentially. Well, which meant deregulate and lower taxes. And when Harding came into power, he did that, and that kicked off the Roaring '20s, which was 9 years of what looked like prosperity, although the middle class and the working class actually saw their wages decline, much like right now. But people who were in the upper middle class and the very wealthy made off like bandits. And then it all crashed in 1929, which I think we're going to revisit in the next year or two.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
I think so, too. But I don't hear any of the candidates talking about what is the plan for these huge multi-billion-dollar industries.
Oh, the plan is pretty straightforward.
They're not going to give up their power willingly.
No, you do it with incentives. You put a tax on carbon, for example. Just even a modest tax on carbon would begin the process of completely restructuring our economy, because our economy is so dependent on carbon. I mean, they did this with sulfur dioxide. In fact, it was George Herbert Walker Bush who did it. The cap and trade program on sulfur dioxide to stop. Sulfur dioxide causes acid rain, to stop acid rain, and it worked. Business jumped in and said, okay, the taxes are pushing us in this direction, so we'll go in this direction. Makes perfect sense. So, you do it with incentives, and with regard to the health, insurance industry, you phase it in gradually. I mean, even Bernie's, which is the most, radical is the wrong word, but the most direct, the most right to the point. Takes 4 years to phase in. So, it can be done. Julia, thank you very much for the call. It's great to hear from you. I appreciate the call. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. By the way, while, the bought-off Republicans this morning in the House of Representatives were voting to defend a president who gives massive tax breaks to billionaires and to big corporations, what was the Senate up to? I mean, it wasn't this morning. It was yesterday. But the Senate, the Republicans in the Senate yesterday voted unanimously to do away with the law that says that health insurance companies may not discriminate against you if you have pre-existing conditions. I'm not making this up. It got no coverage at all, which to me is mind-boggling. The Republicans yesterday voted unanimously. Well, actually, there was one Republican who didn't vote with them. That was Susan Collins. She's starting to feel the heat. And frankly, the thing that has really cranked up the heat on Susan Collins is this one guy who just met her in the airport. He was flying home to Maine from Washington, D.C. She was flying home to Maine from Washington, D.C. He saw her in the airport. He walks up to her. Now, keep in mind, Susan Collins has not done a town hall in 20 years. She has not interacted with her constituents in Maine in 20 years. So this guy walks up to her and asks her a question, and it's been a few weeks since I read the story. I don't recall the exact details of the question, but basically, asks her a question about something that's going on, whether it was impeachment or health care. My apologies. You can Google it. But he asks her a question, and she gives him, a gibberish answer. And I mean, they're like, waiting in line to board the plane. And so he says, that's really not an answer. I mean, what about this? And she just gives him another gibberish answer, and then he says, okay, cool. And she says, I've got to go take a phone call or whatever. And so then he's standing in line, and she's standing there with one of her aides, and she starts talking to her aide about how rude he was. How dare he approach me, essentially. So he goes back to Maine, and he buys a full-page ad in the Maine newspaper saying, Senator, I asked you this question. You refused to talk to your constituents in town halls. Would you please answer this question? And that becomes big news in Maine. And now he's published a second ad in the paper that has been signed on to by like 400 prominent Mainers who are saying, Senator Collins, please answer the damn question. So anyhow, she's feeling the heat. But all the other Republicans voted to go along with Trump's proposal to allow health insurance companies to sell policies that can discriminate against people with pre-existing conditions, where the insurance company, you buy the insurance policy, you think, hey, I got a great insurance policy, it's only $200 a month, amazing. And then you get cancer. And then the insurance company comes back and says, you just asked for $100,000 worth of chemotherapy. We just discovered that back when you were 19 years old, you smoked cigarettes for a year. That puts you at risk for cancer. You have a pre-existing condition. We're going to deny your payment. Sorry. Raise your money on GoFundMe.com. Right? Put some tin cans in the local 7-Elevens. This is what the Republican senators voted for yesterday. Again, because they're wholly owned. They're owned by the insurance industry. They don't give a rat's ass about what's best for America. They don't care about you. They don't care about their constituents. They just care about who's paying the bills, because the Supreme Court in 76 and 78 legalized bribery. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Tim Morrison is testifying today, by the way, in the impeachment inquiry. I'll tell you about that after the break, and we'll pick up your phone calls. Our book today is Cyber War, How Russian Hackers and Trolls Helped Elect a President, by Kathleen Hall Jamieson. This is from the introduction. Imagine a strategy memo forecasting cyber attacks by Russian hackers, trolls, and bots designed to roil social discontent and damage the electoral process of a major party U.S. presidential nominee. Or, if she winds up winning, sabotage her ability to govern. Guaranteed payoff, no fingerprints, no keystroke record, no contrails in the cloud. To ensure that Americans would believe that disparaging messages about her were made in the U.S., use Bitcoin to buy space and set up virtual private networks on American servers. Distribute hacked content stolen from the accounts of her staff and associates through an intermediary, WikiLeaks. Use identity theft, stolen social security numbers, and appropriated IDs to circumvent Facebook and PayPal's demand for actual names, birth dates, and addresses. On platforms such as Instagram and Twitter, register under assumed names. Diffuse and amplify your attack and advocacy through posts on Facebook, tweets and retweets on Twitter, videos on YouTube, reporting and commentary on RT, blogging on Tumblr, news sharing on Reddit, and viral memes and jokes on 9gag. Add to the mix a video game called Hiltendo, in which a missile-trading Clinton figure vaporizes classified emails sought by the FBI. Employ online agitators and bots to upvote posts from imposter websites such as blackmattersus.com to the top of such subreddits as r/TheDonald and r/Hillary for Prison. Drive content to trend. To maximize the impact of your handiwork, use data analytics and search engine maximization tools built into social media platforms. To test and fuel doubts about the security of U.S. voter information, hack the electoral systems of the states. And throughout the primary and general elections season, seed the notion that if Hillary Clinton were to win, she would have done so by rigging the election, an outcome that would repay her assaults on the legitimacy of their leader's presidency with doubts about her own. Were she instead to lose, she would no longer be a thistle in the toned torso of the hackers and trolls' boss's likely boss. Every result but one produces a desirable outcome for the Kremlin. Outcome 1, Clinton is off the international stage. Outcome 2, she wins but can't govern effectively. Outcome 3, the former Secretary of State is elected and the country simply moves on, but the sabotage nonetheless has magnified cultural tensions and functions as a pilot from which to birth later success, perhaps when she runs for a second term. The only eventuality that damages the Russian cyber soldiers and their commander-in-chief is the fourth, in which, in real time, the cyber attackers are unmasked by a vigilant intelligence community, condemned by those in both major political parties and around the world, characterized by the media as spies and saboteurs. The Russian message is blocked or labeled as Russian propaganda, and when included in media accounts, the stolen content is relentlessly tied to its Russian origins and sources. None of that, however, happened. Instead, to the surprise of the Russian masterminds, as well as both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, he won the Electoral College, and with it a 4-year claim on 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Although countrywide she bested him by almost 2.9 million votes, he unexpectedly captured an Electoral College majority by running the table. By the end of the evening of November 8th, Florida, as well as Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania were in his column. The ways in which Russian hacking and social media messaging altered the content of the electoral dialogue and thus contributed to Donald Trump's victory are the subjects of this book. To begin my exploration, this overview chapter will highlight key findings of the U.S. intelligence community, preview my focus on the hackers and trolls and the synergy between them, justify casting the Russian machinations as acts of cyber war, outline ways in which susceptibilities in our system of government and media structures magnified their effect, and note 5 presuppositions that will shape my analysis of the Russian trolls' work, and one that will guide my study of the effects of the hackers. Forming the backdrop for my inquiry are 3 reports on the Russian intervention of the 2016 presidential election. The October 7, 2016 statement jointly issued by the Department of Homeland Security and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence on Election Security. The January 2017 conclusion of the U.S. intelligence agencies, CIA, FBI, NSA, and the February 2018 Robert Mueller indictment of 13 of the Russians allegedly behind the social media intrusions. On a day that will live in campaign lore, as much for what didn't happen as what did, more on that in a moment, the first of the 3 revealed the following. The U.S. intelligence community is confident that the Russian government directed the recent compromises of email from U.S. persons and institutions, including the U.S. political organizations. The recent disclosures of alleged hacked emails on sites like DCLeaks.com and WikiLeaks and by the Guccifer 2.0 online persona are consistent with the methods and motives of Russian-directed efforts. These thefts and disclosures were intended to interfere with the U.S. election process. Such activity is not new to Moscow. The Russians have used similar tactics and techniques across Europe and Eurasia, for example, to affect public opinion there. We believe, based on the scope and sensitivity of these efforts, that only Russia's senior-most officials could have authorized these activities. That's from the report. The next report put a name to one of those senior-most officials and specified an intended beneficiary, Donald Trump. Cyber war is the...
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
So Mitch McConnell comes out and says, yeah, good luck, guys. He says, look, I think it's pretty clear our Democratic colleagues do not have a great affinity for President Trump, but the country cannot afford for Democrats in Congress to take a 1-year vacation from any productive legislation just because they'd rather obsess over impeachment. This is a guy who has 230, maybe it's 260 now, pieces of legislation sitting on his desk sent over from the House of Representatives that he's refusing to allow even a committee hearing on, much less a vote, including several pieces of legislation that would secure our elections from interference by foreign actors. And you got Seth Abramson out there saying, yeah, in the last 2016, it wasn't just the Russians, it was the Saudis, it was the UAE, he went through the whole list here on this program. And Mitch is like, yeah, it's all good. You know, they're the same billionaires who own us, right? I mean, you know, Citizens United made up in 2010. They expanded the Buckley Doctrine to say even foreigners can own American politicians. And guess what? Now they do. I mean, we talked yesterday, you know, about the Republicans who were taking money from Ukrainian oligarchs. Over $7 million. Going to Mitch McConnell and a couple of other Republican senators who are, you know, doing everything they can to help out Trump. I mean, this is going to be a really difficult fight. Anybody who thinks this is going to be easy or, hey, it's obvious Trump admitted the crime. That's, you know, even Richard Nixon didn't admit the crime. The tapes revealed the crime, but Nixon never admitted it until he resigned. And even then, he didn't admit any crimes. He was just like, well, you know, I guess being president isn't going to work anymore. And keep in mind, Richard Nixon, for those of you who are young enough that you don't remember, Richard Nixon had been vice president for 8 years to Dwight Eisenhower, who was generally, even among Democrats, a beloved president. Richard Nixon ran against John Kennedy in 1960 for president and came within a whisker of winning that. He was a very popular politician. And then when he ran again in 1972, he ran in 68, he was elected. In 72, he was elected overwhelmingly. George McGovern carried only one state. Nixon was fabulously popular. When this started, that was 72. The impeachment proceedings began in late 73. And we're now in the spring of 74, and the House is voting to investigate him, and only 4 Republicans said, no, don't investigate him. What changed between then and now? The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court changed the rules of the game. And that's the thing that troubles me the worst, the most. So, anyhow, Sean in Stamford, Connecticut. Hey, Sean, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, how's it going?
Good. What's up?
Okay. This is a question that's been gnawing at me for the longest time, and basically, it's
a question of what? I'm sorry, I missed the word.
It's gnawing at me.
Oh, gnawing at you. I got it. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, my mouth does that to me sometimes. Anyway, I wonder that, as you mentioned about Nixon and Republicans in the 70s, my thought is, I wonder if a lot of this, like foreign money from like Russia or other things that we don't know about, have changed the calculus of the way the Republicans are voting and the way they see Trump, because
they have.
Trump may have something over them.
I mean, you know, Mitch and a couple of other Republican senators have taken over $7 million just from one foreign oligarch. You know, I mean,
right.
it's and God only knows where all the rest of it's going. I mean, there's just this mind-boggling pouring of money coming into. Yeah, I thought I had a story on. Oh, here it is, right here. This Michaela Tindera on Forbes magazine. This was published 2 days ago. At least 20 billionaires behind dark money group that opposed Obama. This is Americans for Job Security, and they spent millions and millions of dollars against Obama back in the day. Now we know that it was Charles Schwab and Doris Fisher and her kids, and you know Richard and Helen DeVos, and Richard Kinder and Dan Wilkes and Ferris Wilkes and Robert McNair, and you know all the people whose names you don't recognize, but they're all billionaires. And these are not foreign billionaires, but I guarantee you that there's foreign money being poured into the Republican Party right now as we speak.
Yeah, and the NRA and all that too.
Yeah. The NRA laundered $30 million out of Russia. So yeah, that's what's going on, Sean. That's absolutely what's going on. Sean, thanks for the call and thanks for bringing it up. Marty in Windham, Maine. Hey, Marty.
Susan Collins territory.
Yeah, was my characterization of how Mainers are responding to this guy trying to talk to Susan Collins in the airport accurate? Is that as big a story in Maine as I've been reading out here in Portland?
It is in the major Portland, Maine newspaper, the Press Herald. Mm-hmm. And yes, there have been 2 full-page ads. We're beginning to see, of course, the letters to the editor coming in, and sort of maybe from, quote unquote, other witnesses that were there trying to recharacterize the situation. But this person, and trying to malign the character of the person who did this.
Right.
So it's not unexpected.
Yeah. She pointed out that over the last 20 years, although she didn't say over the last 20 years or over the last decade or whatever it was, he's given a few $1,000s to progressive candidates.
That's right.
Yeah. So, anyhow, you called about impeachment.
Yeah, I did. So I'm wondering if you could just take a moment and perhaps ultimately boil it down to two sentences, not to be too tough on you. You had once gone through the history of why the impeachment clause is in place, and specifically bribery, and I think also with respect to one of the very specific statutes, I think it's Title 52, 30121, about foreign nationals directly and indirectly making contributions. It seems what I'm missing in just the discourse that can really sell the case is, why are these types of violations relatively much more important than, say, just other run-of-the-mill law breaking that may be happening?
Right.
And why is this the one that really should upset people?
Well, in the context of impeachment, first of all, back when the debates were being held in Philadelphia, and as I recall, it was in July of 1787 when the discussion was held about impeachment, and I don't have that right in front of me right now, but I have in the past quoted from it at some length and ranted about it. Yeah, I don't have it, with the actual quotes from the actual people who were there, but basically, the main thing at that time, America having just fought a war against Great Britain and having Spain in Florida threatening our southern border, France in what we now call Louisiana threatening our southern and southeastern border, and of course the Great Britain and Canada threatening our northern border. One of the big concerns was a president who might be beholden to a foreign interest. And in fact, that was used against John Adams in his election in 1796. The fact that he had defended the British soldiers who shot Crispus Attucks, the Boston Massacre. And it was used against Jefferson because he had spent several years in Paris as the U.S. envoy to France. So, there was this terrible concern that a president might have loyalties to a foreign government, or might be involving foreign governments in American politics. So that was just like so verboten, it was like so over the top that it was unimaginable. And of course, that's what Trump did. He reached out to a foreign government, and it turns out now he's reached out to several foreign governments and said, would you please help me in this election? In fact, it's what he did when he said, Russia, if you're listening, get Hillary Clinton's tapes. And sure enough, they went and did it. So, that is the foreign piece of that, I think, is the part that, flips everybody out. That domestic politics stop historically. This is pre-Buckley. We always used to say politics stops at the water's edge, right? At the edge of at the borders of the country. In other words, when our president is overseas, we don't trash talk him. The first major exception to that became Obama, and Trump and other Republicans were trash talking Obama when he was out of the country. And then secondly, of course, you don't solicit the help of foreign governments for this. Have I answered your question, Marty?
Basically, I'm not sure that it would be easy for me to then speak with a very mixed community up here where I am.
Here's your sentence, Marty. Trump tried to collude, or Trump tried to bribe a foreign government into manufacturing dirt on American politicians.
That's excellent.
That's the bottom line.
Any chance you can feed in the relevance or irrelevance to either the bribery side or the contributions and donations by foreign national side of quid pro quo and intent, and whether it makes any difference if one side initiates.
Well, the bribe that he was soliciting or offering, it was on both sides. He was basically saying, I will give you a visit to the White House, roughly $400 million in military aid, and a certain level of international recognition. I'll give you those things if in exchange you'll give me dirt on Joe Biden. And so, he's soliciting a bribe and he's offering a bribe. And the impeachment language in the Constitution says that a president may be impeached for treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. And high crimes and misdemeanors, by the way, was defined by the people in the Constitutional Convention as maladministration, as badly running the office of the presidency. And I think that you could build, right, you could build a very, very strong case that putting an oil lobbyist in charge of the Interior Department, that is selling oil leases on federal lands, putting a coal lobbyist in charge of the EPA that's supposed to clean up the air caused by burning coal, putting a telecom lobbyist in charge of the FCC, and there's a long list. There's like 6 or 7 of them who are heading up federal agencies, lobbyists, and then there's over 170 lobbyists that Trump has installed in senior positions throughout. That is maladministration. And therefore, that in and of itself is impeachable in any other day or era. But again, the Supreme Court essentially legalized all this with the Buckley decision, the First National Bank decision, and the Citizens United decision. And this is the consequence that we're suffering. Marty, I got to move along, but thank you very much for the call. Great to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I believe you were listening to WCPT. We'll be back. It's 46 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the True People's Media. Stick around.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
Helping you win the water cooler wars. 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, right here, Thom Hartmann. We'll be back. And welcome back. Jim in Salisbury, North Carolina. Hey, Jim, what's up? Thanks for watching Free Speech TV.
You bet, and thank you for taking my call. I just wanted to push back slightly. You had mentioned at the start of the show, I believe, that two Democrats voted against the resolution.
Correct.
And my issue was that when you said, I get it, I understand what you're saying, I get it, but at the time when we really, really need the vote for a cause that I think is, we haven't seen anything like it in my lifetime anyway, that we don't give them excuses simply so they can continue to have a job.
Yeah.
We need them. We're calling on them. And
here's the mistake that I think they're making, Jim. My point was that I'm not going to go all circular firing squad on these guys. I think their own voters are going to do it for them. What they're missing, they're assuming that as Democrats, they can get the votes of Republican-leaning voters or independents who are Republican-leaning or listen to Rush Limbaugh and, right-wing hate radio and watch Fox News. They're assuming that they can get some of those votes and therefore they don't want to offend those voters. I think that they're making a huge mistake. I think that Donald Trump is absolutely right in this regard, that elections are won by the base. They're won by getting out the base. They're won by energizing the base. They're won by throwing red meat to the base. They're won by doing what the base wants. They are not won by being, I'm the guy in the middle and you can just trust me and I can reach across the aisle and all this. Jim Hightower wrote a book about this. He said the title of the book was The Only Thing in the Middle of the Road are dead armadillos and a yellow stripe. And it's true. And I think that these two Democrats are going to get their butts kicked in the next election. And had they voted with the Democrats and had they taken strong positions and had they even taken progressive positions, I think that they would have energized the people in their districts, but the base in their district, and they might have gotten out enough of those base voters to overcome the Republican onslaught that they're going to be facing. But I have a feeling that they're toast.
Okay, fair enough. I just that it caught my attention.
Yeah, no, I get it, and I'm if the stakes were a whole lot higher, I would not be quite so much making that argument. I mean, if it was the presidential election or something, but I think right now that rather than focusing on two Democrats who just basically were playing the role of the cowardly lion in The Wizard of Oz, pre-Dorothy, right? that those two Democrats, they're listening to these corporate advisors. And sadly, so many Democrats do. Whereas the Republicans have completely figured out. You go to your base and you go to your funders, and on the Democratic side, the funders are individual small donations, the people. and unions, basically, fight for working
I
people.
get the same emails. I get the same emails from Trump's campaign.
Yeah. Okay. Then you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yes.
And you read
I
those.
get 'em.
You read those emails from Donald Trump, and I got one this morning from Don Jr. It's a witch hunt, and these guys and they're socialists, and they want open borders, and they're gonna destroy America and high taxes, and all this poll-tested stuff. But they are just absolutely doing a base strategy, and that concerns me because base strategies actually win elections. Jim, thanks a lot for the call. It's good talking to you, and I appreciate your watching Free Speech TV. We'll be back. It's 10 minutes before the hour. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here with you, the place where despair is not an option. We'll be right back. Welcome back. 9 minutes before the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Susan in Dublin, Georgia, watching us on Free Speech TV. Hey, Susan, what's up?
Hey, Tom. Happy Halloween.
Thank you. Happy Halloween back at you.
I just had a quick question about the pre-existing conditions with the insurance.
Mm-hmm.
I don't get my insurance through my employee, but does that affect also people that get their insurance from their jobs?
It could.
And another question, does that also does it also affect people that get their insurance when you're on Medicare? You get that extra insurance on your own.
Right.
And Tom, one more quick thing. I wanted to give a big shout out to all of your people that tweet or have remarks on YouTube. I read them all, and they are the best.
Cool. Well, thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. To answer your questions, I'll do it on the air here. Number one, with regard to the Medicare, the Medigap plans, which fill in the 20% hole on Medicare Part B, those plans are regulated by the Medicare law. And so this vote by the Republicans, to the best of my knowledge, won't affect those. But with regard to employer-offered insurance, here's how it works. Right now, Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, says that insurance companies may not discriminate against the people who they sell policies to based on pre-existing conditions. They can't say, you already have diabetes, I'm not going to cover you. Or, you smoked cigarettes back when you were 20 years old, and so I'll sell you insurance, but if you get cancer, you won't be able to be covered. They can't play these little games like they used to play right up until President Obama got this passed, the whole pre-existing conditions things. More than half of Americans now have a pre-existing condition as defined by the insurance companies. And right now, it's against the law for insurance companies to kick you off your policy if you get sick with, if your pre-existing condition gets worse or if it leads to something else or whatever. They can't do that. What the Republicans, with the exception of Susan Collins, unanimously voted for yesterday in the U.S. Senate was to remove that provision from the Affordable Care Act. And the argument that they made is Americans want cheaper health insurance. We're going to give it to them. And of course, the health insurance companies are saying, if we can kick people off their policies when they get sick, again, we can easily drop the cost of insurance. Your $600 a month premium might go down to $300 a month. But good luck if you get sick. And those policies can be bought by individuals, or they can be provided to workers by employers. So in answer to your question, Susan, yes, this could also affect, it could also affect that. Morris in Long Beach. Hey, Morris, what's up?
Yeah, Professor, let me tell you something. I don't care how much money they raise. They're going to lose the election. You got that? They can raise $1 billion. They're going to lose.
I sure hope you're right, Morris. I mean, that's what we saw in 2018 when we retook the House. And I hope it's going to replay. But I think that was a big wake-up. And the billionaires have been pouring money in like there's no tomorrow ever since.
Well, they need voters. Students ain't voting for them. Middle class was left of them. They ain't voting for them.
Yeah, but most students don't vote, period.
Well, they voting right now, brother, because we promised them we're going to relieve your student debt. They don't have enough white nationalists to put the guy in the office.
Well,
But
that's
Trump's number one ally, Professor. I ain't written 24 books like you. But I believe this, Trump's number one ally is not the billionaire class. Trump's number one ally is the DNC. When I heard you say that the DNC had $8 million, that's why I decided to call you. If you put the mob in charge, Ocasio-Cortez and them, they'd have $80 million overnight. Am I telling the truth?
Yeah, I know. There's some rumbling about Tom Perez and the DNC, and the DNC is still, walking down the middle and not taking progressive positions because more than half of their members are not progressive. The Progressive Caucus represents a little less than half of the Democrats in the House of Representatives, and that's changing actually very, very rapidly, Morris. If you look over the last decade, I mean radically rapidly. But we've still got a ways to go, and I have a feeling there's going to be more of that kind of change as we go into primary season next spring. But we'll just have to let it shake out. Morris, thanks for the call. It's always nice to hear from you. Jeremy in Woodland, California. Hey, Jeremy, what's up?
Yeah, Tom, thanks for taking my call. I'm a little bit in a disagreement with your caller right before me, Morris from Long Beach, because I'm very concerned about the money disparity.
Yeah, me too.
My belief is that as long as the Electoral College exists, money will always be an issue.
Yes.
Because
even without the Electoral College, money will be an issue because they can carpet bomb you with advertising.
Well, I understand that, but I'm looking at the fact that the Electoral College elects presidents,
right? Not
the general population,
right?
And so when you look at states like Montana, South Dakota, North Dakota, they have as many electoral people as California does.
Right. Well, actually, no, they don't have as many electors. You get one elector for each of your two senators. They have the same number of senators, and then you get one elector for each member of the House. So California has an additional 34 electors. Montana has 1, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah.
But your point about the Electoral College is right. What they do, and I'm sorry to cut you off, Jeremy, we're hitting the end of the hour. But your point about the Electoral College is absolutely right. And that's why all of this focus is happening on 6 or 7 potential swing states. Everybody's putting all their money and effort into those states, and that's where the election's going to be decided because of the Electoral College. Jeremy, thank you so much for the call. You're on to something. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Our book today in the Thom Hartmann Book Club is The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment by yours truly. This is from Chapter 1, The Unholy Alliance of Racism, Genocide, and Guns. In Isaiah 14:21, the Lord tells Isaiah, "Prepare for his sons a place of slaughter because of the iniquity of their fathers." It's a variation on the old story of karma and seems in a very real way to be playing out today in the United States. America is facing an epidemic. Public health officials use that word of gun-related suicides, accidents, and even homicides and police killings. That epidemic has grown worse in the past decade, largely because the number of guns in America has increased, in large part because of the racial fears of white men who have bought guns in record numbers for 8 years during the time in office of America's first black president. A landmark 1999 study from researchers Franklin Zimmerman and Gordon Hawkins showed that the main correlation, far surpassing mental illness, socioeconomic status, or race, that could be defined as causal in predicting the rates of gun deaths is a simple number: the number of guns distributed among society. In the 30 years since that study, Zimring and Hawkins's results have been replicated and reanalyzed dozens of times. As the American Academy of Pediatrics said in a release published in AAAS's Science magazine, quote, new research shows dramatic differences in the number of children hospitalized and killed each year in the U.S. from firearm-related injuries based on their state's gun legislation, even after adjusting for poverty, unemployment, and education rates. It found twice as many pediatric firearm deaths in states with the most lenient gun regulations compared to states where gun laws are strictest, end quote. They added that this is a critical issue for children, quoting Stephanie Cho, MD, the lead author of the abstract, quote, firearm-related injuries are the second leading cause of death among children in the United States. But we found a clear discrepancy in where those deaths happen that corresponds with the strengths of states' firearm legislation. In states with lenient laws, children die at alarmingly greater rates, end quote. And unsurprisingly, America not only has unusually lenient gun laws, but also has more guns in civilian hands than any other country in the world. America has a bit more than 4% of the world's population, but holds almost 50% of all the guns in civilian hands worldwide, more than 390 million guns. And the more guns a society has, the more gun deaths it will experience. The NRA and their army of lobbyists have been quite successful in making this happen. During Obama's presidency, there was a steady and hysterical drumbeat of articles, emails, and political proclamations by so-called pro-gun politicians and think tanks, suggesting that Obama was preparing to take away everyone's guns at any minute. There was even a subtext embraced by the hard right that he wasn't going to stop there. After disarming white Americans, these folks said, Obama was going to intern them in otherwise unused FEMA camps. Flipped-out gun owners were repeatedly arrested during the Obama years trying to break into retired or temporarily vacant military facilities and toxic waste sites, looking for evidence to prove that Obama was, in fact, preparing the modern-day version of the World War II-era Japanese internment camps. White supremacy was the founding notion of this nation. White Europeans thought themselves so superior to the human beings they met here in 1492 that Columbus himself became the first North American slaver, shipping Taino Indians back to Spain as slaves to the royal family. A slave is as good as gold, Columbus wrote for the king and queen. Europeans in the Americas then stepped up that game into a hemisphere-wide campaign of racial genocide, pulling off the largest multi-generational mass murder in the history of the world. In the midst of that effort, they also created the legal mechanisms necessary to define and legally regulate slavery, and even built those systems into America's founding document, the Constitution. America was birthed in slavery and genocide, and both needed guns. It was the superior weaponry of guns that gave the European settlers a massive advantage over the bow and arrow-equipped Native Americans, and it was the raw power of widespread white ownership of guns in the South that propped up the institution of slavery for hundreds of years. Without guns, neither would have been possible, or at least neither would have been as easy as they were to pull off. And now, after centuries of guns being used to kill off and keep down people of color in America, those same guns are creating a terrifying epidemic of gun-facilitated violence, from public schools to private homes and public concerts. It's enough to make one think that Isaiah was onto something. Chapter 2, The Sanitized History of America. The United States' expansion and conquest in the late 18th century through the 19th century and into the 20th century is a history written by white men, inked in the blood of Native Americans, and built on the broken and bloody backs of enslaved people brought here from Africa. From 1791, when the Bill of Rights went into effect, until the end of the Civil War, the Second Amendment protected the rights only of white men to own guns. This is simply because until the ratification of the 14th Amendment, states determined who was recognized as a person protected under the Constitution. Initially, in most states, that meant that white men who owned land and paid taxes were the only people considered full citizens under the Constitution. In the South, white men with guns formed slave patrols to control slaves and formed posses to hunt escaped slaves. The book, The Hidden History of Guns and the Second Amendment. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The hidden history of the Supreme Court and the betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. We've been talking about how legalized bribery has affected pretty much everything in American politics. How Richard Nixon had only 4 Republicans dissent from saying, yes, let's investigate him. And then, that was in 1974. Then 2 years later, the Supreme Court in the Buckley decision says, oh, it's just fine for billionaires to own politicians. 2 years after that, the First National Bank decision, they say it's just fine for corporations to own politicians. That led to this avalanche of money that led to the Reagan Revolution, and here we are. And ever since then, it has seemed partisan, but really what it is about money. We'll continue that conversation in a few minutes. But speaking about money, Professor Richard Wolff is with us, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, the author most recently, he's the author of numerous books, his most recent, Understanding Marxism. Democracyatwork.info is his website, plus rdwolff with 2 Fs.com. And you can tweet him at Prof. Wolff with 2 Fs. Professor Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So I sent a note to you, or I think Sean did, last week about this article that I had read about this guy is saying it's a massive scandal at the rating agencies, that they're, based on a Wall Street Journal investigation, finding that there is all this corporate debt that is rated investment grade, but that if there's even a small increase in interest rates, it'll suddenly become junk status. And it's such a large pile that basically it could crash the economy. Am I accurately characterizing that? And tell us what this is all about, what this means, and why the average person should care.
Well, the average person, you're absolutely right, number one, but the average person should care because the last time we allowed this sort of thing to happen, back in 2006, 7, and into 2008, it crashed global capitalism. It led to 4 or 5 million Americans losing their homes, many more losing their jobs, many who have had to go back to work at lower pay, fewer benefits, and all the rest. So the risk to all of us of not paying attention to what we're about to discuss is extreme. So let me explain. Capitalism being the unstable system that it is, after the crash in 2008, the desperate Federal Reserve and the government at that time, first under Bush, then under Obama, took extraordinary steps to try to contain the enormous damage that had already been done from plunging us into a 1930s type of depression. And one of the things they did was to pump massive amounts of money into the economy and to drop interest rates to unprecedented levels, even including minus, that is less than zero, which trillions of dollars are now being lent at around the world, and the United States is part of that. Well, when you drop interest rates to virtually nothing, what you're doing is giving an incentive to every corporation that has a problem. Either it can't sell what it makes, or competitors are squeezing it, or workers are demanding a decent salary, or whatever it is, bad decisions perhaps that the executives have made. There's now an easy out. go borrow this unprecedentedly cheap money because the interest rate is virtually nothing. As if to prove the point, the explosion of corporate debt over the last 10 years has no parallel in American history. Corporations have been borrowing literally like it's going out of style. And what the article in the Wall Street Journal did was basically say, what is happening to the so-called safety of all these corporate debts? Because when a corporation borrows, it issues something called a corporate bond. The person who lends money to the corporation gets a piece of paper, this corporate bond, which is the guarantee that the corporation will pay back what has been lent to it, plus interest every year according to the deal that was negotiated. So corporations have been loading up because they solve every problem imaginable, including many that should not have been handled that way, by using this cheap money, which they never were able to access before. And what the Wall Street Journal does is say, well, has that been reflected in the credit rating that the company gets? In other words, people who are thinking of buying that company's stock, people who are thinking of lending to the company, people who have small businesses that sell something to that company and want to be sure to get paid, they're all interested in how safe it is to do any kind of business with a company loaded up on debt. And the Wall Street Journal article explains that the rating agencies, that's 3 companies in America dominate that, Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch. What they have done is not lower the credit rating, despite the fact that their credit rating should have been lowered because these companies are carrying levels of debt, which mean that if we have a downturn or if the Federal Reserve dares to raise interest rates, we're going to see these companies collapse, and with them our economy. So it is, in fact, very scary.
So they basically built a time bomb under our economy, and in the process of doing so, a small number of senior executives and banks that issue these corporate bonds have made probably hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
Absolutely. And here's another way of looking at the irony. Because capitalism crashed, that was the problem. They came up with the solution of very low interest rates, only to discover now, 10 years later, that the quote-unquote solution has made a problem potentially worse than the problem it was the solution for. This is an economy that's spinning out of control when it goes through these kinds of gyrations with the risk it carries for everybody else.
So if the economy were to crash, let's say that, you know, it seems like there's a worldwide recession happening right now. China, you know, is going back to Hong Kong's officially in a recession. Might just be the upset, but who knows? Europe, large chunks of Europe are in recession. If there's a worldwide recession and, you know, not associated with a big deflation, but interest rates go up in the United States, and basically the pin gets pulled out of this hand grenade, to mix my metaphors here, and the U.S. economy goes into a tailspin. When I look at 1932, what I see is the Great Depression taking a bite out of the United States and taking a bite out of Germany. Germany had a leader, or 1933, Germany had a leader, Adolf Hitler, who had one way of solving that problem. The United States had a leader, Franklin Roosevelt, who had another way of solving that problem. I would argue that Donald Trump's solutions are much closer to what Mussolini and Franco and Hitler were using to get out of the Depression than what FDR used, and that this crisis could easily present an existential threat to the United States. This could be Trump's Reichstag fire, particularly if he gets reelected and it happens in the first year of his new presidency. Do you think that I'm like way out on thin ice thinking like that?
No, but let me offer a couple of qualifications. Mr. Hitler at least had the opportunity to say that this colossal mess that he walked into, and remember he takes power in January of 1933, that this mess is older than him and in no way his fault.
Right. Same
now,
with FDR.
while that is also in the long run true here, Mr. Trump has taken many steps in his 3.5 years or 3 years to be held accountable. The enormous tax cut to business in December, this crazy trade war with China, which is hurting the United States every bit as much as it's hurting China's economy. I mean, we really have a spectacle in which the world and Americans see that for Mr. Trump to play his card of making America great again by appearing to be Mr. Tough Guy has in fact held hostage the world economy to his reelection campaign. He's under a lot of pressure and blame if this economy tanks. That's why he's putting the kind of pressure on the Federal Reserve to lower interest rates, no matter how crazy that is under these circumstances. Capitalism has had an economic downturn every 4 to 7 years. We're overdue for the one that happened last in 2009 because it's more than 4 or 7 years.
So,
bottom line has to be that Mr. Trump will be held responsible if the crash happens before the election. So I believe his strategy now is to do everything in his power to make the crash happen after the voting is over.
Well, and in fact, here's this just at the very top of the Washington Post 5 minutes ago, big red stripe, breaking news. White House officials and congressional Republicans have begun early talks on a new package of tax reductions and economic growth measures under pressure from President Trump, who is agitating to announce a new tax cut proposal heading into the 2020 election. There you go.
Absolutely. That's it. That's what he wants. And, you know, every economist I know who isn't on Mr. Trump's payroll understands that after a period of growing inequality, the last thing you want is to exacerbate the splits, the divisions, the hostilities in this country with more inequality-boosting tax cuts of the sort he did in 2017. And you don't want to juice an economy already overjuiced by these devices, because the old truth will haunt us. The longer you postpone this, the worse the crash will be when it hits. It's just like not going to the doctor when the pain is a little and then being told when you've waited too long that the time for solutions has gone by. You're now going to have to take the bitter medicine. This is playing with absolute fire what is going on now, and that's why that story in the Wall Street Journal alerting us to this crazy, cozy relationship in which the rating companies provide credit ratings to the companies who pay them for the ratings and therefore don't lower them despite the overuse of credit. I mean, it is basically lying to the vast American people, hoping nobody notices until the crash comes when we'll all be running for cover.
Yeah. Remarkable. Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, democracyatwork.info, rdwolff with 2fs.com. You can tweet him at Prof. Wolff. Professor Wolff, thank you for dropping by.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to speak with you.
Really appreciate it. It's always so informative. We will be right back with more of the news of the day and my rant about Donald Trump and his naked attempts at basically bribery of Republican senators going on right now in front of us, right after this.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And, of course, your phone calls. We'll be back. And welcome back. Let's see here. Lou in Torrington, Connecticut. Hey, Lou, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom, it's an honor to speak with you, and happy Halloween.
Thanks. Back at you.
I have a question. Maybe I'm not as informed as I should be, but if a president is impeached, should they be allowed to run for a second term? And if so, shouldn't we have an amendment to the Constitution preventing that?
There is no law that says that, to the best of my knowledge. And, if somebody's been impeached or removed from office, they, generally speaking, the idea is that they can run for office later. I mean, case in point, Roy Moore. Roy Moore got kicked off the Supreme Court down in Alabama, and then he ran again, right, for the same position. So he wasn't. I'm not sure that he was impeached, but it might have been an impeachment. I'd have to go back and look. But there's nothing that specifically forbids it. I think that the founders figured that, it would be so obvious to everybody that this person is like absolutely wrong for the country. He's such a bad president. He got impeached, that he would have no electoral success trying to make a comeback.
Well, you try telling that to Trump supporters.
I know. It's like, this absolute firewall of Fox News is pretty bizarre. Thanks a lot for the call, Lou. Good to talk to you. Beverly in McKinley, Illinois. Hey, Beverly, thanks for watching Free Speech. What's up?
Hi, Tom. Thank you. I wanted to pose, the idea of moving this or stalling it to go later, the impeachment and the hearings.
Right.
Everybody, news media talks about how fast it needs to be. Wouldn't it be better if the hearings in the House were held in January so that the public could watch them? They're all going to be tied up with Christmas and scheduling. Then it's forefront, all the issues on their mind when they're going to vote. And it would help the senators who don't have to go off the trail. And then if we could stall, all we need to eliminate is a month from February 3rd to March 3rd to get through all those primaries. Will eliminate enough of the senators anyway where they won't have to worry about it. And just make it more on the front of people's minds and maybe bypass some of the minimums for when other Republicans can jump into the race.
Yeah.
Wouldn't later be maybe more advantageous than earlier?
I think so, Beverly, and I've said on this program a number of times that I think that, people this is back a month or two ago, and people were saying, oh, it's going so slow, and Nancy Pelosi isn't moving fast enough, and I was like, if this thing is moving slowly and it ends up being shifted into early next year, the closer you can get it to the election, the more damage it's going to do to Trump, in my opinion. Now, I may be wrong on that. The more it may activate his base, and particularly if he wins in the Senate, if he stays in office, the more he'll claim vindication. But it has taken on a life of its own, Beverly. Right now, the impeachment inquiry, since Trump committed this bribery, and Democrats need to start calling it bribery and the solicitation of bribes, or extortion. But bribery is the word that they should be using, because that's the word in the impeachment clause in the Constitution. And that's exactly what Trump did, by the way. He offered a thing of value. That's a bribe. So, if they can successfully educate the American people about it, I think at a larger level, it almost doesn't matter when that happens. But I think that also, the events have taken on their own life, and it's not going to be something that can be stalled or stopped just for politics. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. This is doing to the United States. Well, welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And I just want to recap the point that I was making earlier in the program about basically Donald Trump and bribery. We now have Donald Trump explicitly raising money to help with his impeachment efforts. for Joni Ernst and for Thom Tillis, and there's one other Republican. Let me find the article here. And, basically just laying it out to the jurors. Right? These are the jurors. And Cory Gardner, Colorado's Cory Gardner. He is raising money for the jurors in his upcoming trial. Now, Richard Painter, who was George W. Bush, he's a lifelong Republican. He was George W. Bush's ethics chief. He was the head ethics lawyer in the White House during the Bush administration, has come out and said that this is criminal felony bribery, in his opinion. Now, I'm not so sure that Citizens United didn't make this legal, but it's the sort of thing that would have to be adjudicated, which is not going to happen before the 2020 election, in all probability. But right now, Trump is putting his thumb on the scale. He's corrupting the jury, the Republicans who are going to sit in judgment of him. And when the vote happened in the House of Representatives this morning about whether or not there should be an inquiry into impeachment, keep in mind when this happened with Nixon, and Nixon was fabulously popular with the American public at the time in 1973, 74. Nixon won the 72 election. He was reelected. He won 49 states, as I recall, in his reelection effort. He was, the Republicans were solidly behind him. And yet only 4 Republicans voted not to investigate him, voted against the investigation. The vote was 410 to 4. Today's vote was 232 to 196. Not one single Republican broke ranks. Why? Because they're all being bribed. Because the Supreme Court legalized this in the mid-'70s, which brought us the Reagan era, brought us neoliberalism, brought us the rise of the billionaire class, brought us all this income and wealth inequality in the United States, and basically ended, over the course of about 40 years, basically ended our democracy. Now the middle class doesn't get what they want, regardless of how they vote, which is the definition of democracy, when you do get what you want, based on how you vote. Now it doesn't happen anymore. Why? Because of legalized bribery by the Supreme Court. We'll be back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And as noble an effort this may be, and as clear the crime of bribery that Trump committed may be, I'm really worried about this bribery thing. Today we're reading from David Blight's book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. This is from the introduction. In his speech at the dedication of the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C., September 24, 2016, President Barack Obama delivered what he termed a, quote, clear-eyed view of a tragic and triumphant history of black Americans in the United States. He spoke of a history that is central to the larger American story, one that is both contradictory and extraordinary. He likened the African American experience to the infinite depths of Shakespeare and Scripture. The, quote, embrace of truth as best we can know it, said the president, is, quote, where real patriotism lies. Naming some of the major pivots of the country's past, Obama wrapped up his central theme in a remarkable sentence about the Civil War era. Quote, we've buttoned up our Union blues to join the fight for our freedom. We've railed against injustice for decade upon decade, a lifetime of struggle and progress and enlightenment that we see etched in Frederick Douglass's mighty leonine gaze, end quote. How Americans react to Douglass's gaze, indeed how we gaze back at his visage, and more important, how we read him, appropriate him, or engage his legacies, informs how we use our past to determine who we are. Douglass's life and writing emerged from nearly the full scope of the 19th century, representative of the best and the worst in the American spirit. Douglass constantly probed the ironies of America's contradictions over slavery and race. Few Americans use Shakespeare and the Bible to comprehend his story and that of his people as much as Douglass. And there may be no better example of an American radical patriot than the slave who became a lyrical prophet of freedom, natural rights, and human equality. Obama channeled Douglass in his dedication speech, knowingly or not. So do many people today. Born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, a slave, in Talbot County, Maryland, in February 1818, the future Frederick Douglass was the son of Harriet Bailey, one of 5 daughters of Betsy Bailey, and with some likelihood his mother's white owner. He saw his mother for the last time in 1825, though he hardly knew her. She died the following year. Douglass lived 20 years as a slave and nearly 9 years as a fugitive slave subject to recapture. From the 1840s to his death in 1895, he attained international fame as an abolitionist, editor, orator of almost unparalleled signature, and the author of 3 autobiographies that are classics of the genre. As a public man, he began his abolitionist career 2 decades before America would divide and fight a civil war over slavery that he openly welcomed. Douglass was born in a backwater of the slave society of the South, just as steamboats appeared in bays and on American rivers, and before the telegraph, the railroad, and the rotary press changed human mobility and consciousness. He died after the emergence of electric lights, the telephone, and the invention of the phonograph. The renewed orator and traveler loved and used most of these elements of modernity and technology. Douglass was the most photographed American of the 19th century, explained in this book, and especially by the intrepid research of 3 other scholars I write upon. Although it can never really be measured, he may also have been, along with Mark Twain, the most widely traveled American public figure of his century. By the 1890s, in sheer miles and countless number of speeches, he had few rivals as a lecturer in the golden age of oratory. It is likely that more Americans heard Frederick Douglass speak than any other public figure of his time. Indeed, to see or hear Douglass became a kind of wonder of the American world. He struggled as well with the pleasures and perils of fame as much as anyone else in his century, with the possible exceptions of General Ulysses S. Grant or P.T. Barnum. Douglass's dilemma with fame was a matter of decades, not merely of moments, and fraught with racism. The orator and writer lived to see and interpret black emancipation, to work actively for women's rights long before they were achieved, to realize the civil rights triumphs and tragedies of Reconstruction, and to witness and contribute to America's economic and international expansion in the Gilded Age. He lived to the age of lynching and Jim Crow laws, when America collapsed into retreat from the real victories and revolutions in race relations that he had helped to win. He played a pivotal role in America's second founding out of the apocalypse of the Civil War, and he very much wished to see himself as a founder and defender of the Second American Republic. In one lifetime of anti-slavery, literary, and political activism, Douglass was many things, and the set of apparent paradoxes makes his story so attractive to biographers, as well as to so many constituencies today. He was a radical thinker and a proponent of classic 19th century political liberalism. At different times, he hated and loved his country. He was a ferocious critic of the United States and all its hypocrisies, but also, after emancipation, became a government bureaucrat, a diplomat, and a voice for territorial expansion. He strongly believed in self-reliance and demanded an activist interventionist government at all levels to free slaves, defeat the Confederacy, and to protect black citizens against terror and discrimination. Douglass was a serious constitutional thinker, and few Americans have ever analyzed race with more poignancy and nuance than this mostly self-taught genius with words. He was a radical editor, writer, and activist. The book Frederick Douglass by David Blight. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Check it out. Wow, what a lot going on. There's so much going on right now, and I just think that so much of this is so symptomatic. I mean, Trump bribing his jurors right now, right in front of all of us. Billionaires and big corporations owning the Republicans. Trump coming out today, I mean, just an hour ago, the Washington Post breaking the story that Trump is putting together another tax cut. Obviously, it's not going to make it through the House of Representatives. And then if the economy crashes before, see, this is like a fail-safe for Donald Trump, particularly given the conversation I just had with Professor Wolff. If Trump proposes a tax cut, and the Senate votes yes on it, and the House votes no on it, and Trump is selling this to people, and Limbaugh and Hannity and Fox News and all these guys are selling this to the American people as this will help the economy. Without this, the economy might be in trouble. And then the Democrats say, no, we're not going to vote for another damn tax cut. And the economy fails before the election. Trump's going to blame it on the Democrats in the House. You didn't get our tax cut through, our stimulus through, and therefore the economy sucks. He's setting it up. How do you think that's going to work out? I'm guessing, again, politically, at least for those on the right, it will work. But we'll see. Joel in Grand Rapids. Hey, Joel, thanks for listening to WPRR. What's up?
Well, I heard your economist a little while ago talking, and I'm still not sure what he feels would be the reason for the next crash. I know in 29 it was people borrowing to buy stock. It didn't work out well. In 2001 it was a tech bubble. In 2008 it was the housing fiasco. So what is he? Does he say the corporation huge debt? Is that the reason? Well,
there's a couple of things that could tip it over. One is corporate debt is literally at an all-time high. I mean, all-time high. Whether you look at it as a percentage or as, an absolute, obviously in absolute numbers it would be simply because of inflation, but it's at an all-time high. So is consumer debt. Yesterday I did the story about how these, consumer loans that are not credit cards and not mortgages or car loans, they've jumped up to being about 50% of the loan market now. It's because people are they're having to go in deeper and deeper and deeper into debt. They're maxing out their credit cards, and now they're getting personal lines of credit just to maintain a middle-class lifestyle because jobs that pay well are vanishing, and they're being replaced by jobs that pay minimum wage. And, so the middle class is vanishing. We heard the story a couple of weeks ago that the middle class in the United States, which was over 60%, almost two-thirds of us when Reagan became president, is now below 50%. So all of these things push toward a moment when basically companies can't pay their bills. If the middle class stops buying, the thing that drives 70 to 80% of the economy is consumer spending. So when consumer spending dials back, and by the way, there was a report this morning that I read in the newsletter from the Aiden forecast, that trucking now for 3 quarters has been on a decline. Now that's typically a 1-year early indicator that people are dialing back on their purchases, which means that a year from now you're going to see that echo through the economy to the point where businesses start reducing the amount of inventory they have, and so they start because their stuff isn't selling at retail. And so they start saying to manufacturers, cut back on this stuff you're making, and then the manufacturers cut back, and that means laying people off. And so and as people get laid off, they buy less because now they don't even have a minimum wage job. They've got no job at all. And as they buy less, consumer demand decreases further, which causes more layoffs. And it's a spiral. It's a downward spiral. So that could happen on the consumer side, and in fact, almost certainly will. In fact, I think it's already started. The other thing is on the corporate side, as you get all these very, very large corporations that are no longer even paying income taxes, I mean, you know, which is pretty mind-boggling, issuing all this debt that is being rated investment grade right now, if interest rates go up at all, they won't be able to pay back that debt. Or alternatively, if consumer spending goes down at all, and many of these companies, probably the majority of these companies, are in some way dependent upon consumer spending to maintain their profitability, to maintain their position. If that happens, then the companies go down and they start laying off people, and then you get that downward spiral. And the other thing that points to that, for example, J.P. Morgan Chase, it was just revealed yesterday or the day before that they took, my recollection is it was $18 billion, but don't quote me on that, but it was billions. It was over $10 billion, that they used even some of their own depositor cash to buy back their own stock. In fact, the principal thing that has been driving the increase in the stock market for the last 2 years is not that companies are making more money. It's not that companies are selling more goods. It's not that they're expanding their product lines. It's that they're buying back their own stock to reduce the number of shares in the marketplace. So if a company's worth $1 billion and it has 1 billion shares, every share is worth $1. If they buy back, 10% of those shares, if they buy back $100 million worth of their own stock, and Apple has bought back over $1 billion worth of its own stock. If they buy back $100 million worth of their own stock, their stock goes up 10%. Now, because there's only 900,000 or 900 million shares out there. And if you're following my math here, Joel, and this is what has been driving the stock market for a couple of years. And particularly in the last 2 years, companies have been using their tax cut money to buy back their own stock right across the board. And that's starting to come to an end, too. That started slowing down dramatically this year compared to last year. I mean, last year it was put on turbocharged by the tax cut. And that's why Trump wants another tax cut. He wants to keep this absolutely unsustainable Ponzi scheme going, basically. Have I made sense to you, Joel?
But can I ask you to do a small favor?
Sure.
I wanted to ask a favor of you. To do a constructive criticism, actually. Can I do that?
Yeah, I suppose.
Well, I listen to you every day at work. And a lot of times you read the same thing day after day, and when you do that, I switch to NPR because I can't,
Oh, you're talking about our book reports when our commercial stations are doing the news at the top and bottom of the hour.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got about 200 of those in the pot, and they randomly recycle out of the automation system, and really, during the 6 minutes at the top and bottom of the hour, I really do need to take a break and get ready for the next segment. And our commercial stations are not even on the air, so that's a kind of conversation that really we shouldn't be having on the air, Joel. Comments like that, feel free to make them. Just make them to Joyce, the person who answers the phone, and she'll make a note of it and get back with me. Bill in St. Helens, Oregon. Hey, Bill, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. Just a couple points. First off, all this whole thing about the quid pro quo, that's icing on the cake. But we know Trump broke election law by soliciting political information from a foreign government, and we know he broke election law again by encouraging a foreign leader to break our election law. But
right, and these are not small laws; these are felonies.
No, so they keep on thinking like somehow if it's not a quid pro quo, none of this happened. Well, but it did. So to me, that's an aside. But
he also, by the way, broke election law when he paid off Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal. That is a felony as well. Yes. That's a felony for which Michael Cohen is sitting in prison right now. And individual one is still in the White House.
But so I'm looking at Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, the little last paragraph where it says any person holding office of profit or trust under the United States without the consent of Congress will accept or any present or emollient. Emollient can quite simply be interpreted as compensation. Trump was soliciting a favor, so it wasn't even a matter of him accepting the help from the Ukraine. It was a matter of him actively soliciting something of value from
That's
Ukraine.
Correct.
So to me,
it's suborning perjury.
A direct violation.
Bribery. Sorry.
Yeah. So to me, Section 9, Article 1, Section 9, it should be the go-to. That's like even above all the rest of this. He clearly and knowingly attempted to violate the Constitution. He didn't get what he wanted,
right,
but he actively solicited. It wasn't offered. He solicited it. So I don't know. We're not talking about that.
Well, and he's been doing this with his Washington, D.C. hotel. He's been doing this with Tunbury in Scotland, where he had ordered the military to put their people up at his hotel and spend millions and millions of dollars at the local airport that was going to be otherwise closed, which would have hurt the business to his hotel or to his golf resort. I mean, there's multiple instances of this guy just basically being a grifter. I mean, this is the bottom line, Bill. We have a grifter in the White House. We have a guy, a con man in the White House. And, I mean, there's no other way to describe it. Well, I mean, you could add other things to that. But, he's been a hustler his whole entire life. He's a hustler right now. Increasingly, I think he's absolutely broke. I think that's why he's putting the D.C. hotel up for sale. It's not because of the emoluments clause. It's because he's running out of money. It's why he took the chance of trying to say, let's have the G7 at the Doral. Anyhow, we'll be back with more of your calls after this.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
It's 45 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program, speaking the truth to the multinational corporations and billionaire politician bribers would rather you didn't know. And welcome back. Let's see here. Bob, watching Free Speech TV in Westminster, Colorado. Hey, Bob, what's up?
How you doing? I'll try to make it real quick. First of all, I want to say you've written about your books. It's almost 100% right on, because I've been following this debacle and this thing since 1980, and all my work, realize. The other thing is, I feel, based on what I see on the vote, when it comes to the election and all the stuff going on, we're at DEFCON 4.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're really beyond that almost, because this is going to be the most vicious and most brutal and most violent election since 1900.
I agree. And,
I see it.
Right, since
I don't know what we're going to do. I hope there's enough people that wake up. I'm afraid they won't, because of the stuff I hear and I see on the street. It just concerns me. And being a veteran, I'm so angry that they've been able to diss veterans. Because I was at the 1st Cav Division in '67 and '68. We had 27 killed in my unit.
Oh my, that's a tough one.
Anyway, I'll let you go.
Okay.
But anyway, thanks for your help.
I share your concern, and this is where and why we just need to really get active about this. Bob, thank you for the call. Douglas in Seattle. Hey, Douglas, what's up?
Hey, quick comment. Article 1, Section 3, Senate powers under the Constitution for what's called impeachment.
Right.
And cases of impeachment judgment in cases of impeachment shall not extend further than removal from office and disqualification to hold and enjoy any office of honor, trust, or profit under the United States.
Oh, wow. Thank you for that, Douglas. I had completely forgotten. You're absolutely right. So if Trump is impeached, he would be forbidden from holding high office, from running for president again.
If he's convicted, not impeached.
Right. If he's convicted. Yeah, if he's removed from office.
If he's convicted, he will be removed from office and he may never serve again.
Yeah, the nightmare scenario here is Trump gets impeached in the House, which is a virtual certainty, I think, now. And that goes to the Senate for the trial. They hold a trial, and at the end of the trial, the Republicans are still, there's still a firewall for him. Keep in mind, it's post-Citizens United. And then he runs for re-election saying, I've been vindicated, just like in the Mueller report. He keeps saying, no collusion, no obstruction, even though that's not what the Mueller report says. After this, he would say, no quid pro quo, no bribery. And he wins re-election, and then he does what Viktor Orban did in Hungary when he won re-election. Alter the Constitution. You've got 33 states now that are on board to rewrite the Constitution. He gets together with his billionaire buddies, rewrites the Constitution, does away with the free press. He's already stacking what is supposed to be an independent judiciary, and turns America into Hungary. It turns America into a semi-fascist autocratic state. I think it's entirely this is an entirely plausible scenario.
And equally as plausible is just like Puerto Rico, 30% or more of us on the streets.
Yep. I think that's entirely possible too.
Refuse to do anything.
Yeah, and the fact that half of eligible voters don't even bother to register to vote, and of the ones who are registered to vote, about half of them don't vote. That's also very troubling, and that's something that hopefully people will get what the stakes are and show up. We'll be back. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.
Want to connect with the show online? You can find the Thom Hartmann Program on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Arrested for a crime and convicted of supported videos. Check it out. Tag you're in. Welcome back. 51 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here with you. Teresa in, is it Kiau, Hawaii? I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that.
Actually, it's in Pahoa, Hawaii. It's okay. After you made a statement regarding the Republicans passing, the vote on health insurance companies,
right.
I called both of my senators, and Hirano clerk said they don't know about it, they'll research it. But then Schott's office said that, no, the vote was failed. It failed.
Yes, it did.
So, votes taken on health care matters failed.
Yes.
So I researched it,
Yes, it did. My apologies, Teresa, if I implied that vote succeeded. It did not. It did not overcome a filibuster.
Yeah, it's SJ Res 52, and I Googled it, and it's all what you said about, companies having strengthening their health care market and stuff.
Right, deny people with pre-existing conditions health coverage, basically, or pull the coverage when you get sick. Yep.
Yeah. So I was like, because I've got, rheumatoid arthritis, psoriatic arthritis, and I'm taking care of my kid sister with Down syndrome, and then there's my Vietnam veteran husband, with a pile of stuff's going on with his health care.
Yeah.
So that, kind of blew me off. So I just wanted to, double check on what I thought.
You're absolutely right.
And
Teresa, thank you for that, because if my point was at the same time that the Republicans in the House of Representatives were, as a bloc, voting not to even investigate whether Donald Trump has committed crimes, the day before that in the Senate, the Republicans were voting, and they voted, with the exception of Susan Collins, unanimously, to say that health insurance companies can now start screwing people again, basically based on pre-existing conditions. But it didn't, you're absolutely right, it didn't succeed. The vote, as I recall, was 53 to 42 or 43 or something close to that. All the Republicans minus Susan Collins, and of course all the Democrats voted against it. Teresa, thanks for pointing that out. Steve in Atlanta, Georgia. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Hey, I just happened to turn on the program, and I heard you talk about the Republicans wanted to pass, or Trump wanted to pass tax cuts.
Yeah, he's proposing this today.
Yeah, because the economy may fail. So the Democrats need to get out there and they need to be screaming, you can't have it both ways. You can't be sitting there saying the economy's great, but then turn around saying it's in trouble.
Right.
So you can't have it, you can't have it both ways.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I don't think that he's going to do the sales pitch of, well, actually, I think he probably will, which is what I said earlier, that he's going to say that on the one hand, if you vote for this, it will help the economy. On the other hand, if you vote against this, that will hurt the economy. He's not going to say the economy's in trouble and therefore you need to vote for it. But he will say, I predict, if the Democrats defeat this in the House of Representatives, it will hurt the economy, actively hurt the economy. And of course, the economy, as we all know, is hanging by a thread right now.
Yeah, and that's what the Democrats need to say is, okay, apparently so the economy is hanging by a thread. That's why we need this legislation.
Right, right. Yeah, and if, in fact, the economy is actually hanging by a thread, then let's increase aggregate demand, which is what drives economies. And aggregate demand is a fancy word for wages, so let's just increase the minimum wage. And, of course, the Republicans will never go for that because they only support billionaires.
And they need to keep pointing out, look, we've tried this. We tried it with George W. Bush. It fails. We have so much evidence that this kind of thing fails.
And we tried it with Reagan and it failed.
Right.
I mean, we had two of the worst recessions outside of the Great Depression were in the first 4 years of the Reagan administration.
Yeah, they have no credibility. I don't understand why people keep listening to them. There's no credibility.
Because they have a massive media infrastructure. They've got on television Fox News, and on radio they've got right-wing talking points and right-wing hosts in literally every city in America. There's not a city in America where you can't hear right-wing basically lies on this stuff. So that's what's going on. So anyhow, Jeff, or Steve, I'm sorry, I need to move along, but thank you for the call. Jeff in Acto, New Jersey. Hey, Jeff, what's up?
Yeah, how you doing?
Good.
Yeah, I found out that my congressman did not vote for impeaching Trump. He's only two Democrats not.
Yeah, Van Duren and Peterson.
Yeah, well, Van Duren's mine.
Okay.
And I called them up, and they told me the reason why they voted not to impeach him was because the Senate wasn't going to impeach him. They were going to just let him go.
Yeah.
And I told them that.
And so what did you say to that?
And I told them, I says, I'm going to tell all my friends not to vote for you next year when you run.
Wow. See, this is my point, is that base strategies typically win elections. Going down the middle of the road typically loses elections, and this is a lesson that the Republicans have been, they've been running base elections now since Reagan, and Democrats haven't run a base election since Lyndon Johnson. And Democrats really need to. And these Democrats who think that they're, if they, we're going to be in the middle and we're not going to, and we're not going to offend anybody, and the people in the middle, the independents, are just going to love us. They are, whistling past the graveyard. Jeff, thank you for the call, and good on you for calling your member of Congress. We need to let people know that we're paying attention. Not again, like I said, I don't want to be doing the circular firing squad on these two guys. I get it that they're in tough districts that are Trump districts, and they think they're doing the best thing. Their votes don't really matter today. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
We say fight back!
Our book for today on the Thom Hartmann Book Club is Kingdom of Lies, Unnerving Adventures in the World of Cybercrime by Kate Fazzini. This is from the preface. It didn't take me long in my career as a cybersecurity executive to figure out everyone was lying to me. The biggest lie of all came at the very beginning, that cybersecurity is hard, too hard, certainly too difficult for someone who lacks years and years of deep technical training. That is no place for writers. That thicket of incomprehensible jargon alone seemed meant to discourage outsiders like me from entering the field. They told me I could never hope to understand the terminology unless I'd worked around it for a very long time, unless I had a special and complicated certification, unless I knew how to take apart and reassemble a computer, unless I knew how to code in Python and could read it, interpret it, and spot problems on sight. And if I somehow managed to learn the lingo, the learning curve for the rest of it would prove insurmountable. Lies, lies, lies. It's unfortunate because there's a huge gap between the demand for cybersecurity workers and the people available to fill those jobs. I think one of the reasons for that is because people can't imagine themselves doing this kind of work. Can you use a smartphone, make a PowerPoint, think on your feet, ever organize a night out to the movies with your friends that went well and nobody crashed their car to or from the event? Welcome to the 21st century's hottest career path. Are you able to charm the pants off women? Did you escape an abusive marriage? Have you ever hosted a toddler's birthday party at your home? Honey, I want you on my cybersecurity team. After reading the stories in this book, you will understand that what makes cybersecurity complicated is the complexity of human beings. So if you know how to deal with people, you can handle internet security. If you understand what makes people tick, not only will you be able to recognize a threat, you'll be one step ahead of your adversary. During my career as a cybersecurity executive at multinational corporations, a journalist for Wall Street Journal and later CNBC, and a professor at Georgetown University, I've met a lot of fascinating people. From the hackers who perpetrate malicious attacks to the security professionals who try to prevent these incidents from happening, and the alphabet soup of government agencies that do damage control. At the end of the day, they're all fathers, sons, mothers, sisters, and spouses. In other words, people just like us. Yes, the white hats cross paths with black hats and change alliances more frequently than you might expect, but they're driven by the same desires as the rest of us, even if sometimes it feels as if everyone in cybersecurity is allergic to the truth. As a professional, I was told a great many lies about the field I have grown to love so much. After becoming a journalist on the cybersecurity beat, I was told even more. Here are a few. Let me introduce you to the hacker community. This lie is usually delivered with a wink and a nod from someone who thinks they know every hacker on the planet. The truth of the matter is there is no hacker community. Sure, the guys who make a splash at the big annual conferences might say otherwise, but every country, every state, every faction, every identifying group has its own community of people who hack computers. Some of them are extremely conservative. Others are massively liberal. Some fall in between. Some wear suits and ties and work as lawyers during the day, while others look like everyday citizens and have great people skills as they pursue the idiosyncratic agendas. Some are good guys who got fed up with the low pay and boring duties and became criminals. Some are criminals who ended up being good guys. Many start and end their careers on either end of that spectrum. Some, including many you'll meet in this book, are extremely proficient hackers who have no time or inclination to identify with any community at all. As a journalist, I was astonished at the number of people who came out of the woodwork to offer me exclusive access to the hacker community. I couldn't help but notice that the members of the source's hacker community were often people just like him or her. My point is there are many different types of people working in this field, and I can guarantee you that a lot of them are exactly like you. Here's another lie. He's a luminary in the cybersecurity field. He's probably not. Fame and luminescence don't typically intersect in this field. The people I've met who are actual geniuses aren't famous, and most of them don't have social media profiles. They tend not to pontificate on areas outside their expertise. The people who are constantly headlining conferences and who are so often offered up to me for interviews have less insight than those who stay underground. Anything a high-profile hacker is willing to share typically carries with it a massive and crystal clear agenda that I've learned to spot from a mile away. Even if a conversation is off the record, the intel coming from a top government official or other marquee corporate cybersecurity name carries little novel information. The only people who have illuminated the way for me in this world, and in this book, have been genuine practitioners who never held a C-level title. You've never heard of them, and because I've changed their names to protect their privacy, you probably never will. They are luminaries not because of the degrees they've collected or the events they've headlined, but because they carry a lantern that guides the path for others. These types of people typically don't have a public relations team. One of my favorite lies, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This one is usually delivered by someone who asserts that he or she knows the cybersecurity field better than anyone else. These people will brag that they know what it's like to be a hacker and can do things that no one else in the room can do. I'm always wary of those who try to establish their bona fides by discrediting the expertise of other cybersecurity professionals. The depth and breadth of this field is so vast that anyone who works in it is an expert at some part of it. And I have yet to meet someone who is an expert at all of it, not even close. Every view of an incident is informed by the reviewer, what he sees, what her level of expertise is, and that changes over time. It's like asking someone who lives in the Plaza to describe Manhattan. The book is Kingdom of Lies by Kate Fazzini. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, importantly, the framers of the Constitution gave no consideration to the rights touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Of God.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. That was an interesting one. It's Halloween. We've got a real live witch on the line, Pamela Grossman. Pam Grossman, she's a writer, curator, teacher of magical practice and history, host of the Witch Wave podcast, and author of a new book, Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power. And Pam, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. You know, as tempted as I am to deal with this, like, you know, oh, hey, let's have fun, it's Halloween, and all that kind of hokey stuff. This is actually a serious topic that has some substantial depth. I've only had an opportunity to spend a little bit of time with your book, but a dear friend of mine, Rianne Eisler, has written a number of books, The Chalice and the Blade, and a number of others about the history of women and women's rights throughout history. I mean, in a large and a multi-millennial context, multiple thousands of years. Len Schlein wrote a brilliant book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess. What I learned from those two people, who I both knew, Lena has passed on, but in fact, Rianne and I were just talking about a month ago in email, is that prior to the 1500s, basically, to the 16th century, women played a major role in society in power functions. They were physicians, they were healers. That Mary worship was the principal practice in Christianity. Virtually all the churches in Europe were dedicated to Mary up until the early 1500s. And then something happened, and nobody's quite sure exactly what it is. Len Schlein's theory was that basically literacy got legalized, and that changed the way our brains work. But who knows? But something happened, and the men rose up and basically took over, and all those women who were celebrated as great healers and midwives and herbalists became portrayed as witches. And there was a publication of this nasty, nasty book, The Malleus Maleficarum, or whatever it is. I'm sure you know. And, you know, in the late 1400s, early 1500s, that just like brought all this stuff forward. And Len Schlein pointed out, within 2 generations,
women went from being venerated to being actively burned at the stake as witches all across Europe. Can you speak to that?
Absolutely. First of all, I'm a big fan of both of those writers, and it's amazing that you got a chance to get to speak with them directly. I'm only familiar with their books. But essentially, what you're talking about is the witch hunts that happened in Europe and then a little bit later in the New England colonies. And you're absolutely right. A lot of that was sparked by the advent of the printing press and the Malleus Maleficarum, which is the book that you're referring to, which in English is translated roughly to The Witch's Hammer, was a book that came out at the end of the 15th century. It was written by a man named Heinrich Kramer, who was a friar, and he essentially was trying to link together the idea not only that witchcraft was real, because a lot of people believed that witchcraft was real, but that it was specifically women who were most susceptible to the devil's temptations to draw them into witchcraft, because he believed that women were lusty, he believed they were stupid, and ambitious, interestingly, and gossipy. And because, certainly anybody could have been a witch back then, or was considered to have been a witch, he was really the first person to popularize the notion that it would usually be women because they had that weaker, as he believed, kind of temperament. And then ever since, we have considered witches to be linked with women for better and for worse.
Right, and this has led to, 6 centuries of persecution of women and justified patriarchy, justified the exploitation of women, justified men holding power in virtually every dimension in ways that are, if you look at it in the arc of, the last 500-600 years, literally just starting to break down in my lifetime. In the last 40, 50 years, we're seeing women elected to Congress, women elected to the Senate, more on one party than the other, certainly, but possibly a woman becoming president of the United States. In fact, the last woman who ran got 3 million more votes than the guy who's in there right now.
That is a fact.
Yeah, so it seems to me that things are getting better, generally for women. How are things getting better for women who practice non-traditional religions, or who, as you call yourself a witch, who would embrace those kinds of titles?
Absolutely. And you're right. Slowly but surely it is getting better, though not fast enough, in my opinion.
Amen.
But what's really interesting is not only that people are identifying as witches in a more positive way now, and I'll certainly talk about that, but actually with every wave of feminism since the 19th century, we've seen the figure of the witch be reframed and reclaimed as a positive feminist icon. So what we're experiencing now in this fourth wave of feminism is an extension of those other waves. And essentially what's happening is multifold. First of all, there are a lot more people like myself, people of all genders, we should say, who are identifying as witches for literal spiritual reasons. They, like me, are practicing some form of modern witchcraft. I personally call myself a pagan, though I'm also still Jewish. You could call me a Jew witch, if you will. But essentially, there is this growing movement of modern witchcraft practitioners, and that is becoming far less stigmatized with time. But the other thing that's happening is that the witch has become this archetype that a lot of feminists and progressive, rebellious people are tapping into for political reasons. Much in the same way the phrase nasty woman was originally this negative epithet that then people reclaimed for themselves in this more positive kind of like tongue-in-cheek, rebellious way. So, too, we're seeing that with the word witch and the identity of witch for political reasons. So it's fascinating that this is happening at the same time. In my case, I use the word witch to describe myself for both of those reasons, the spiritual and the political.
And you're relatively young. I had a conversation with Rhiannon at her home. David Lloyd, by the way, her husband, has written some brilliant stuff on Darwin. I was a member of his Darwin project, saying that Darwin was not talking about survival of the fittest, which is kind of a tangent, but it's really, if you like Rhiannon's writings, you should check out David Lloyd's stuff. But we were talking about older women, that in traditional societies, even today, in many traditional societies, Aboriginal, Indigenous societies, and in European society prior to the 1500s, older women were viewed as wise. They were the wise elders. Yeah. They were the ones who provided protection. They were often the ones who made the decisions for the community. They had enormous political power. And then post 1500, as the patriarchy emerged, with a vengeance, they were defined as the crone, and that was part of this whole witch archetype. I mean, you see little kids dressed up as witches. They're not just dressed up as people wearing black hats and a cape or something like that. They're typically wearing a mask that makes them look like they're in their 80s, right? Their nose is extended out. They've got old warts on them and stuff like that. They're old. That idea of, can you speak to that idea of, and reclaiming the idea of the older woman as the wise woman? I'm seeing this right now. Jane Fonda, 75 years old, just got arrested, protesting some of Trump's craziness. A number of women have been on this program. In fact, she's been on this program, kind of reclaiming both their femininity and their age. Your thoughts?
Absolutely. So getting back to the time of the witch hunts, though people of all ages and all genders were accused of being witches, it was most often women over 40 who had the most accusations leveled against them. Often they also might not have had children or not enough children. Sometimes they had land and they were widows and people wanted their land. But that marker of them being generally over 40 is a pretty consistent through line. And the reason for that is, as today still, we often consider women who are past reproductive age or past the age of, sexual desirability as no longer appealing, no longer valuable. Whereas, certainly the goddess movement and the feminist movement in general, especially here in America and in the UK, where a lot of it was first sparking, has tried to reclaim the fact that as women get older, even if they're not reproducing anymore or people aren't necessarily desiring them in the same way anymore, that they still have immense experience and wisdom and how valuable that is. So there was a writer named Robert Graves, who you might be familiar with. Mm-hmm. He wrote a book called The White Goddess. And he was really one of the first historians to talk about this framing of goddesses as a triple goddess. And that framing of the triple goddess is said to have three aspects: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. And this triple goddess was, it's something that you can trace in a lot of different mythologies and a lot of different cultures, though Graves was really one of the first people in English to kind of put a framework around it in those terms. And then the pagan community and, later the Wiccan community really latched on to this notion of the triple goddess. It also traces the phases of the moon, going from new to full and then dark again. And some people say that, the crone is related to the dark aspect of the moon. And so it's this idea that women have power at every stage of their life, as does the moon, as does the capital G goddess, if you are one to believe in her or in them. And so it's been wonderful to see the crone be reclaimed in that way, in that witchy, powerful way.
Amen. Pam Grossman, her book, Waking the Witch, Reflections on Women, Magic, and Power. The website, Pam Grossman, GROSSMAN.com. Pam, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and happy Halloween.
Thanks. Oh, and Pam does the Witch Wave podcast. You can tweet her at WitchWavePod. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And happy Halloween to Pam and everybody else. We'll be right back, 18 minutes past the hour. And welcome back. Jonathan in Portland, Oregon. Hey, Jonathan, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I wanted to bring up the incident of Trump calling Colonel Vindman a spy and unpatriotic. This is the National Security Council expert on Ukraine that testified against Trump. And this is the type of thing that the Soviets would do against Jews. It was something that Stalin would do. It's a form of anti-Semitism to question their patriotism. And this is exactly
hang on just a second, Jonathan, if I may. Many of our listeners probably don't realize that Vindman himself is Jewish. Was that
Vindman is Jewish. That's
the
right.
stepping off point for your rant here?
Yes, thank you. And not only is he Jewish, that's the reason his family emigrated here. They emigrated because of anti-Semitism, as many Jews have. And this is the nightmare scenario where formerly Jews were not accepted in Soviet society and least of all able to work for the state. They were considered effectively stateless, really. And so what Trump is doing is he's bringing up all of the most wretched anti-Semitism that Jews suffered in the Soviet Union, or former Soviet Union, bringing up all these things. And by the way, this is not unique. There's another significant event in history called the Dreyfus Affair, where this happened. A similar thing happened in France, where there's in the late 1800s, where there was a Jewish artillery captain who was accused of being a spy and was court-martialed and imprisoned unjustly. And
his real crime was being Jewish.
His crime was being Jewish, and anti-Semitism was rife during that time.
Yep.
So this is a very sensitive thing, and I have to say, particularly among, Orthodox Jews who support Trump. And, this is a very dangerous thing that's going on now.
Why? Obviously, this is a topic that you're well informed about. And one of the things that baffles me is why Netanyahu and why so many people in the Orthodox Jewish community do support Trump. Is it, it has to be something other than just that he'll throw Israel a bone, because there's no shortage of politicians that will do that.
I can't say. I mean, it's another form of religious fundamentalism. Like, I don't think there's any difference between Orthodox Jews and Christian fundamentalists.
So you think it's a shared belief in basically patriarchy? Trump is the ultimate patriarch, and hierarchical, both religious and political systems.
I think there's a mindlessness. I think there's a obeisance to authority, and there is a lack of a sense of autonomy, individual autonomy. People who are very highly, people who are who are so dedicated to a belief that they don't think, and they just follow. They're used to following leaders. I mean, it's a terrible tragedy. But what's going on now, I think, is just so egregious.
Yeah, it really is. Jonathan, thank you for the call. We're hitting a break here, but thank you very much. We'll be right back. It's 22 minutes past the hour. Stick around. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. with you. Welcome back to the program. And let's see here, Clifford in Los Angeles. Hey, Clifford, what's up?
Hey, Tom. I talked to you about a month ago. I'm 72 years old. I'm black. I'm a Vietnam-era veteran, and I'm an independent voter.
Okay.
I can vote Republican and I can vote Democrat. But, Tom, you're going to disagree with what I say, but Democrats have just handed the House and the Senate to the Republicans. Because America is just changed. They don't care what this guy does in the White House. They know he lies. They know he's a coward. They know he's a traitor. They know he's a rapist, but they don't care. And the Democrats have the wrong person running for the president. None of these presidential hopefuls are purposeful for the country.
Clifford, if you're right, and you may be right, if you're right, it means that our democracy is toast.
Well,
it's just that simple.
Look at his rallies. He has 20,000 people at his rallies and 4,000 or 5,000 outside. Now, you can't dispute that. Right. He sits up and lies every a month ago, a woman came on TV and said Trump raped her. Nobody cared. Nobody.
Yeah. That was a one-day story. Yeah, she wrote a book about it. In fact,
the economy is Obama's, and everybody knows. Every sane American knows it. The economy is Obama gave him a great economy, and the Republicans should have. The Democrats every day. The Democrats should have a spokesman. Tell them that they passed over 20 bills. The Democratic Party has passed over 20 bills in the House.
260 bill, Clifford.
Yeah,
260 bills.
But the country doesn't know it.
Yeah, no, I agree. But it's not like the Democrats aren't saying this. They're saying it all the time. It's just that the media doesn't pick it up because the media is so focused on Trump. And that's, in my opinion, that's how, if they hand him the election again, it's going to be the media just like it was last time. Clifford, thank you for the call. Lee in Orlando, Florida. Lee, we got about a minute here to the break. What's up?
Okay, I'm going to be super quick then. You were talking about the economy and the corporations that are loaded with debt. Mm-hmm. I thought after the Trump tax cuts, they were flush with cash. And then secondly, these companies that are rating these debt-ridden companies as investment grade or whatever, these are the same companies that rated the home mortgage bonds as investment grade.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And by the way, they were flush with cash, and they used that cash to buy back their stock. And now to maintain their operations, they're borrowing. That's what's going on.
Yes. But lastly, the fathers under grifters going to grift. This new tax cut that Trump is proposing, is this another corporate tax cut, or is this the middle-class tax cut he promised us before the 2018 elections that never...
We don't know the details yet, Lee. We really don't know the details, so we'll have to wait and see. Lee, thanks a lot for the call. Thanks for listening to SiriusXM. We'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
We'll be right back. It's 27 minutes, coming up on 28 minutes past the hour.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Our book today is by Catherine Bailey. It's A Castle in Wartime, One Family, Their Missing Sons, and the Fight to Defeat the Nazis. It's an extraordinary and fascinating book. This is from the prologue. Dateline Innsbruck, Austria, 16 December 1944. Monica calling steamboat. This cryptic announcement, broadcast to Austria over the Voice of America, was received with relief by a handful of people able to decipher it. The coded message signaled that the Allies were still trying to infiltrate agents into Innsbruck to make contact with members of the Austrian resistance. It was 7 o'clock on a winter's morning, the gray old city walled in by snow-covered mountains. A roof of dense cloud hung over the domes and spires, cutting out the sky on the summit of the Nordkette. Towering 7,000 feet above the city, the sheer face of the mountain rose like a wall, blocking the north end of the fine Baroque streets. The illusion of being confined in a small space was maintained in the alleys and passageways in the medieval quarter. On a chill, gloomy day such as this, passing the tall, narrow-fronted Gothic houses, the sensation was of walking along the bottom of a ravine. Thick wreaths of smoke spiraled beneath the clouds. The day before, American planes had bombed the city, killing 259 people. In Herzog-Friedrichstrasse, a protective shroud covered the famous golden roof of the balcony designed for Emperor Maximilian in 1500. Beneath the bombed-out buildings, parties of children, drafted in from the villages along the valley, worked to clear the rubble. They were watched by small groups of SS soldiers who stood on the street corners guarding the defusing crews. Forcibly recruited from the nearby concentration camp at Reichenau, it was their job to deactivate the bombs that had failed to explode. The Allies were now convinced that Innsbruck, rather than the Reich capital of Berlin, was where the war was likely to culminate. Recent intelligence reports indicated that Hitler was building an Apfelfestung, an Alpine fortress, Alpenfestung, in the mountains that encircled the city. Blueprints obtained by OSS operatives, the OSS is the forerunner of the CIA, point to a chain of underground factories and armories. It was to this remote, impregnable fortress that Hitler and a coterie of his most fanatical supporters intended to retreat when the Wehrmacht was beaten. From here, they would carry on the fight, defended by elite SS troops and sustained by huge stores of supplies that had been carefully stockpiled in bomb-proof caves. With Hitler holding the high ground, Allied military commanders were predicting that the battle to take the fortress could extend the war by up to 2 years and exact more casualties than all of the previous fighting on the Western Front. In these circumstances, intelligence from Innsbruck, the capital of the Apfelfestung, was suddenly at a premium. Alan Dulles, the OSS station chief in Switzerland, hoped to recruit a network of agents from within the city. Their job would be to supply hard military intelligence and assist the passage of U.S. and British forces when they reached the western border of Austria. But as Dulles recognized, Innsbruck was not fertile ground. That autumn, the Gestapo had arrested all known anti-Nazis. Moving from house to house, the mopping up operation signaled their determination to suppress all resistance operations in an area they looked upon as their last bastion. Soon after midday on 16 December, the U.S. Air Force returned to bomb the city for the 4th time that month. A sharp left rally was executed immediately. After bombs away and a course flown around Innsbruck, the pilot reported. Due to undercast, no visual observation of results were possible. Some hours later, Frau Muttenschuldner, a resident of 47 years, sat down to write in her diary. "It is a black day for Innsbruck," she began. "The old city center has been hit, as well as the graveyard. Everyone feared there would be another raid, and sure enough, the enemy bombers came and wreaked their evil. There was no gas or water in the city, and the cemetery was now closed for burials. In the flat, dingy light, the only color was from the fires that had yet to be put out. Fraulein Kummer's photo studio is on fire," Frau Muttenschuldner reported. Vargar's paper warehouse, the stained glass factory at Müllerstrasse, Café Paul in Maximilianstrasse, and Hallensteiner's Gasthaus are all burning. Showers of sparks and burning paper are falling from the warehouse. One would marvel at the eerie beauty of it if it were not such a sad occasion. The raid marked a change of tactic. In addition to dropping 200 tons of bombs, the U.S. planes had dropped thousands of propaganda leaflets. In the coming weeks, they would drop thousands more. These and the messages broadcast on the BBC's Austrian service urged the city's inhabitants to rise up and prevent Hitler from making a last stand in the Tyrol. "Tyroleans, we know that you will not permit it. You will see to it that none of the Nazi leaders can hide. We know that already Tyroleans are fighting the Nazis everywhere. Even if the Nazis still feel secure in your country, we know better. You are on our side." But the vast majority of Tyroleans were not on the Allies' side. The book, A Castle in Wartime. Thom Hartmann Cruise will be sailing in July of 2020. The 7-day Oceania cruise will be going to Bermuda, and I'll be hosting onboard events about the topics of the day. More info at thomhartmann.com or 800-856-1155. Welcome back. In our science fact of the week, it now looks like the Amazon rainforest is just 2 years away from an irreversible tipping point. This is tough news delivered by Monica de Bollé, senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. The tipping point is the deforestation of the Amazon where it cannot sustain itself, and the lungs of the planet could disappear, causing irrevocable damage to the planet and every living thing. De Bollé tweeted, quote, "The time for action is now." So the question, will we listen? Our science fact of the week. So anyhow, back to your calls. David in Woodland Hills, California. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
I believe, in my view, as Bernie would say, the Democrats must have at least 3 separate provable charges against Trump: emoluments, bribery, and obstruction, because the Republicans can always excuse one.
I would add a 4th, and that would be campaign finance violations, which is paying off Stormy and Karen.
Great. They can always excuse one, they can always excuse 2, but everybody in America will believe at least one of them, even the base. They can't excuse them all. So the more charges is essential in this case.
Yeah, I agree with you, David, although we'll see. I don't know. Thank you very much for the call. Carol in Lakewood, New Jersey. Hey, Carol, what's up?
Oh, I'm really surprised that I got through. I love you, Tom.
Thanks, Carol. Thanks for calling.
Absolutely terrific. I'm calling in response to your caller who's talked about Jews being for Israel.
Yeah, well, let's just back up a little bit. The context, for people who didn't hear the call, the context was that Mr. Vindman, or Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, who testified against Trump yesterday, was being vilified by Trump using classic anti-Semitic language. You know, that he was a spy, that he was, an outsider, he was born outside the country, all that kind of stuff. And then, we got into this conversation about why is it that, Netanyahu and so many Orthodox Jews are supportive of Trump. And is it, a common perspective on patriarchy, or what is it? I don't know. And I just left the question hanging. So, Carol, you have an answer to that?
I think I may.
Okay.
Orthodox Jews are they do not want a 2-state solution.
Oh, in Israel.
And in Israel. And Netanyahu is against a 2-state solution. They want Israel to be strictly for Jews.
Yeah.
I have a cousin who is Orthodox and lives in Israel and believes in Netanyahu because they do not want to separate the state so the Palestinians have their own homeland.
Yeah.
And I believe that is why. And part of Lakewood is a very Hasidic community, and the Hasidic Jews in Lakewood are for Trump.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Carol. That's a much less esoteric, answer than speculating about hierarchy or patriarchy or anything like that. That makes perfect sense. Carol, thank you very much for calling and sharing that. Charles in Miami. Hey, Charles, what's on your mind?
Hey, how you doing, Tom?
Good.
My thing is this: with Vindman and him being a Jewish guy or immigrant. It just goes to prove why Republicans don't want immigrants to come into this country, because not everyone is corruptible, especially when it comes to loyalty to America once you become a citizen. Second of all, Donald Trump, if his car was so clean, why does he, reveal the car to America?
Right.
And, let's forget all about presidential whatever, privilege, because he works for us. We don't work for him. So therefore, we have the right to hear that call if we all demand it. And last but not least, I got to disagree with you on if he comes up with this tax plan that it's going to work. I think Democrats missed the ball on the last tax plan because it was the biggest that the Republicans ever had, and we still face recession.
Yeah,
so
although it wasn't the biggest. The biggest was Reagan's. But Trump lied about that, just like he lies about everything.
I understand, but we have to start pushing back that this stuff is not bulletproof. Just the mere thought of a recession, we've had the last 2 quarters at 1.9% in growth. Yeah. Why aren't we hopping on this and trying to cut out tax cuts? Yeah. They don't work.
Yeah, I'm with you, Charles. I'm absolutely with you. I'm spot on. Tim in Seattle. Hey, Tim, what's up?
Hi, thank you so much. I got so furious listening to that caller a little bit ago saying that Trump's going to win and he's got 20,000 people at his rallies. And I know he means well, but he is so wrong. We have how many thousands at the Women's March? Hillary had 3 million more than Trump. Yeah. I looked at a statistic. It said as of July 2016, 36.3 million people identify themselves as Mexicans that live in this country. I mean, all the people that supported Obama, I think the numbers way outweigh the rednecks and the racists that are going to vote for Trump.
In a decade or so, that's absolutely going to be the case, Tim. I mean, we're seeing the browning of America, and I think it's a good thing. We're adding diversity, and old white guys like me are kind of waking up to the reality of a multiracial society and realizing that that's a good thing, even when the old memes that were built into us by exposure to media throughout the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when people of color were portrayed in very negative ways, keep popping up in our heads. I think what makes a more enlightened person is to say, oh yeah, that thought came into my head. Oh my God, step on that one.
Yeah. But I agree.
But this is. And whereas with the Trump followers, that thought pops into their head and they go, oh, that's reality. It's a big difference. But
let me say one thing too, Tom, before you go.
Ahead.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Tim. Go for it.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say real quick. I know you're great about this, but everybody listening, help somebody get to the voting polls. Drive an old person that lives in your building. Make sure Aunt Peggy is registered. Just go crazy. Get involved. Another great way to get involved besides your show and the things that you link, contact your local Teamster offices. Say, can I do phone banking? Can I stuff envelopes? I mean, these people are involved in progressive movements.
Right. Yep. Amen. Tim, thank you very much for the call.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks. Sam in Charlotte, North Carolina. Hey, Sam, what's on your mind?
Hey, I just want you to give me some clarification, and I want to preface my comments by saying I am a Democrat. I'm not a Trumper.
But
just want you to give me this clarification. Yes, I know that President Obama did give leave a good basis for a growing economy.
Mm-hmm.
But I do give Trump credit for growing the economy even more on his watch because of deregulations.
Okay, so explain this to me, Sam.
We're not good for the environment.
Explain this to me. Donald Trump, it used to be that if a coal mine was producing, and they all produce waste, this god-awful slurry and stuff, that they used to have to process it. And it was being processed in a facility that employed 30, 40 people and provided good jobs in the community. Same thing with putting scrubbers on smokestacks. Those were jobs. There were factories that manufactured the scrubbers. When they passed that law that said that the coal mining people in West Virginia, well, actually anywhere in the country, can now simply dump the slurry in the rivers, all those people who were working at the places that used to process that slurry lost their jobs. When they cut back on the smokestack emissions standards, all those people who used to work on cutting emissions lost their jobs. I realized that the profit went up for the coal companies and the profit went up for the oil refineries, but all of that profit just went into the pockets of the billionaires. How does deregulation create jobs? Can you explain that to me?
Well, give me
an example, a real-world example of deregulation creating a job.
Well, I'm thinking one right now, but Deregulation.
I don't think you can think of any, Sam, because deregulation does not create jobs. If you want to create a linkage between regulation or deregulation and jobs, and generally speaking, there's not that much of a linkage. But if you want to create a linkage, the one linkage you can create is the one that I just gave you, which is that if you create a regulation that says that food can't have arsenic in it, then the food processors have to hire somebody to test the arsenic. That's creating a job. If you create, regulation actually creates jobs, not deregulation, Sam, respectfully. Joe in Pittsburgh. Hey, Joe, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom, nice to talk to you again. Hey, here's a question for you, and I want your thoughts on this. I was looking at Democratic Underground, and there was a part on there with Laura Ingraham and John Hugh and another individual, and they were basically smearing Colonel Vindman.
Yeah, John Yoo has walked that back, by the way, since then, but continue.
Okay. Well, my problem with that, Andre, is that these guys don't understand that words do have consequences. When are we going to be able to say that, you can't keep doing this kind of stuff, promoting all this stuff that is, wrong or untrue, and then the guy gets killed?
Yeah. If you look at the history of this kind of demagoguery, this kind of pseudo right-wing populism, this kind of strongman right-wing populism, if you look at the history of how that played out in the Philippines with Duterte, in Egypt with Erdogan, in Egypt with el-Sisi, in Hungary with Orban, in Poland with Duda, in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro, if you look at how that has played out in country after country, it does lead to people being killed. It's led to over 10,000 people being killed that were documented in the Philippines that the president was taking credit for. So, that's the scary endpoint scenario. And now we've seen people killed in the United States. You had this guy who traveled, 600 miles down to El Paso to kill people of Hispanic origin, and he was quoting Donald Trump. You had a guy shooting up a synagogue, killing Jews. He was quoting Donald Trump or citing Trump's memes. These things do have consequences, and in my opinion, Trump's behavior and his actions and his embrace of the hard right have already killed people in America. And frankly, I fear that they're going to kill more. It's a sad state of affairs. It really is. It's 46 minutes past the hour here on the Thom Hartmann Program. We'll be back with more of your calls in just a moment.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archive.
We'll be back in just a moment with more of your calls here on the Thom Hartmann Program, the place where despair is not an option. And welcome back. Mark in Hilo, Hawaii. Hey, Mark, what's up?
Hey, congratulations on running a heck of a good program, one of the better ones on the air.
Bless you, sir.
I'm an independent, and that causes a lot of difficulty when I start trying to have some of my ideas out. And the main one is when Obama took office, I had the greatest hope. You would remember, I'm sure. He got together an equal amount of representatives from each party and said, find a way to save money, spend it basically in better ways. And they came out with some great ideas. And if it had been instigated, would have had enough money to restart mental health in the country, would have had the money to repair our bridges, would have had money left over probably to restore drinking water to the major cities, about 17 of them, to federal standards. Nothing was ever done. And I think
it's not just that nothing was ever done. Those efforts were actively obstructed by the Republicans who were in the pockets of billionaires and industries that wouldn't have benefited from that. Those things would have just benefited average people. And there's only one party that does that works to the benefit of average people. That's the Democratic Party. The Republican Party exclusively works for the billionaire class and the corporations.
Well, see, here's where I get in trouble. At that time, the Democrats, held Congress. They didn't act on it as far as I've seen. I've never seen the bills go to the Senate to get obstructed.
The Democrats had a filibuster-proof majority in Congress throughout the 8 years of Obama's administration for 74 days. 74 days. after Ted Kennedy died and there was that special election and all that stuff, 74 days. In those 74 days, they passed legislation strengthening veterans benefits. They passed legislation strengthening the VA. They passed the Affordable Care Act, giving health care to every person in America. The Supreme Court punched a hole in it later, but it would have covered literally every single human being in the United States. I used to have a little card around here with there's all the consequential, women's rights legislation was passed. I mean, they passed into law a whole bunch of very, very consequential pieces of legislation. They bailed out GM and saved an entire industry. They did those things in those 74 days. After that, the Republicans controlled the Senate and were able to stop anything, or the House, and were able to basically stop anything that Obama wanted to do. So it's really, it's not Obama's fault, Mark, and it's not the Democrats' fault. Thanks for the call. Marilyn in Sun City, Arizona. Hey, Marilyn, what's up?
Hi, Tom. Couple of things about the Jews and why they vote for Trump. This is just a side note.
Well, you can't make a blanket statement like that of the Jews. We were talking about a specific community, the ultra-Orthodox community.
The Orthodox, but they're like the Christians, and I come from both heritages. The idea for them is that the end justifies the means. God, in their mind, can use anybody, just like they'll use the idea that he used Rahab in the Old Testament, who was a prostitute. So that's just their thought. Your callers were right. We don't care what Trump does.
Yeah.
They're accomplishing their goals, and I don't know how.
This is certainly true of the fundamentalist Christians, Marilyn. Marilyn, we just have 15 seconds left. You want to make another point?
I just wanted to talk about health care. I come from Saskatchewan, like Jordan did when he called you on Tuesday. And I've had the same doctor up there. He looked after me, my son, my grandchildren. And so I just think that's a better way to go for health care. I have an in-law who is 95 years old last month.
I got it, Marilyn. So you are a Canadian and you loved Canadian health care is the bottom line.
Absolutely.
Okay. Marilyn, thank you for that. I appreciate the call. We'll be right back. It's 51 minutes past the hour. Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere. Thank you. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And let's see here. Ronnie in Albuquerque. Hey, Ronnie, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a couple of comments. The evidence for impeachment is overwhelming. It's hard for me to understand why some people can't see it. And the name Trump will go down in history as one of the most hated, vilified names through history, similar to Adolf Hitler. And my wife and I were talking the other day, why didn't the fool stay on The Apprentice, do the TV show? Nobody would know.
Well, that's what he was trying to do, Ronnie. That's what he was trying to do. He ran for president and this is why he hired actors to be there in Trump Tower to applaud him, and they hired actors to come to his first rally. He was going to do his announcement and do 2 small rallies And that was it. That was the whole plan. And this is something, Michael Cohen laid this out. This is something that he worked out with some PR people because he learned that Gwen Stefani was making $1 million more than he was on NBC, and her show wasn't as highly rated as his. And so he was trying to get NBC to renew his show and give him a pay raise. That's why he ran for president.
Well, you know what I think, too? There's some Russian mafia motives behind all of this, too. Putin put him in there, and he's paying the price.
Oh, they hated Hillary Clinton. I mean, it's no doubt about it. I mean, it was Bill Clinton who broke the agreement between Gorbachev and George Herbert Walker Bush that if the Soviet Union dissolved, we would never put NATO forces on their border. And then Hillary Clinton had been very aggressive against Russia, or from their point of view. I mean, I think from her point of view, on behalf of the United States. And Trump was totally corruptible. I mean, they had a letter of agreement with Trump for a Trump Tower Moscow that was supposed to execute after the election that got put on hold because he got elected. So, spot on, Ronnie. Steve in Proctor, Vermont. Hey, Steve, what's up?
Hi, Tom. You had a caller before say that Trump's going to win because of what the Democrats have done because of the size of Trump's rallies. Yeah. Let's dispel the whole thing about Trump's rallies. They follow him around as if he's the Grateful Dead.
Yeah, exactly.
He exaggerates the crowd sizes by 100 times because most of these venues that he goes to couldn't hold that many people. And when you have the camera outside, there's not 10,000 people outside. There may be 10 people outside.
Right.
Every rally he goes to, that city, he ends up owing money. He owes the city of Burlington $1 million for appearing here.
Right. Yeah, and he's a deadbeat. He's not paying those bills either. This is true all over the United States. And Minneapolis tried to get him to prepay, and he said, screw you. And then he came to Minneapolis and trashed Ilhan Omar. You're absolutely right, Steve. Thank you for the call, and thanks for pointing it out. Eddie in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Hey, Eddie, what's up?
How you doing? I watch your program a lot, and I just got a little question I'd like to ask your opinion on.
Sure.
What happens to Trump once Trump is out of office? What will happen to his children that making money off the White House? Are they going to stay in there or what?
Well, they're not going to stay in the White House, but, what's going to happen, whether they get prosecuted for some of the grifts that they've been involved with, whether it was Ivanka and Don Jr. with, the Soho Hotel, I believe it was, lying about occupancy rates in order to get investors, Ivanka and all of her patents in China. There are so many levels of corruption, in the Trump crime family. The question in my mind is, does he get impeached for one simple thing, or is he revealed, and I think, frankly, his tax returns will reveal this, is he revealed to the entire world as a con man and a grifter and as fundamentally broke? I mean, Jared Kushner's over $1 billion in debt, for example. How do you have any value at all if you're $1 billion in debt? So, anyhow, we'll see how it all shakes out. I mean, it's up to the Democrats right now. Frankly, it's up to how good a job that they can do of turning over these rocks and revealing the crawly things underneath them that are part of the Trump crime family and its extended tentacles. We'll be back tomorrow, same time, same place. In the meantime, don't forget, democracy is not a spectator sport. Share with your friends how you hear this show and other good progressive media, and get out there, get active, tag You're It. Thanks so much for being with us today. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
We say fight back!
Thom Hartmann here. My new book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America, has arrived. What if the Supreme Court did not have the power to strike down laws? Discover the hidden history of judicial review and this scam called original intent. Learn how we can save the planet by modernizing the Supreme Court. And most important, how we can democratize the Supreme Court now before it's too late. From the time Americans wake up until the time we go to bed, everything we do, touch, ingest, breathe, and use has been touched by the Supreme Court. In this book, I lay out the history of the Supreme Court from Alexander Hamilton until how the court overstepped its constitutional powers. America does not belong to the kings and queens of the court. It belongs to the people. The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America is available now in fine bookstores everywhere.